¿Me pueden poner, ya está dispuesto para compartir pantalla?
Sí, sí, está disponible.
Ah, perfecto.
Bueno, muchas gracias a todas y a todos por acompañarnos de vuelta en este bloque de la tarde del tercer día del primer Congreso Internacional de Lógica, Epistemología y Metodología de la Universidad de Costa Rica. Para la próxima hora nos acompañará muy amablemente la profesora Katia Arroyo, quien estará hablando sobre la epistemología de la educación. Y a continuación le cederé la palabra al profesor Luis Diego Cascante, quien será el moderador de la conferencia. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias a todos y a todas por acompañarnos, tanto aquí en Costa Rica como fuera de Costa Rica. Es un gusto tener que presentar a la profesora Katia Arroyo Guerra, quien tiene una larga trayectoria filosófica y académica. La profesora Katia Arroyo posee una maestría en enseñanza de la filosofía para niños y jóvenes por la Montclair State University en New Jersey. Es también graduada de las carreras de filosofía y enseñanza de la filosofía de la Universidad de Costa Rica y actualmente desempeña como profesora e investigadora de la Escuela de Filosofía y de la Escuela de Formación Docente de la Universidad de Costa Rica, donde además funge como coordinadora de la carrera de Bachillerato en Enseñanza de la Filosofía. También cuenta con una amplia formación y experiencia en el campo de la docencia de la filosofía en la educación secundaria, donde por muchos años se ha encargado y ha trabajado en el curso de Teoría del Conocimiento para el Programa Internacional de Bachillerato. Finalmente, desde hace 7 años, la profesora Arroyo se ha encargado de coordinar el proyecto de las Olimpiadas Costarricenses de Filosofía, al igual que la representación de Costa Rica en las Olimpiadas Internacionales de Filosofía. El día de hoy, pues, la profesora Arroyo nos acompaña y nos dará la conferencia intitulada La epistemología como elemento esencial de la formación educativa. La profesora Arroyo cuenta con 30 minutos. 5 minutos antes le avisaré que se acerca el final de la conferencia y durante 20-25 minutos escucharemos el intercambio con todos nuestros buenos amigos que nos acompañan y amigas el día de hoy. Profesora, muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Es un gusto para el primer Congreso de Lógica, Epistemología y Metodología tenerla aquí. Tiene usted la palabra. Con permiso, y apago y cierro mi micrófono.
Muchísimas gracias a todos y a todas por su presencia y paso seguido voy a compartir pantalla y me voy a servir en razón de un buen uso del tiempo, de leer mi propuesta con algunos matices que intervendré, pero igualmente les voy a proyectar aquí unas diapositivas que resuman algunos puntos principales. Muy bien. Vamos a colocarla de forma completa. Muy bien. Voy a darme entonces a la tarea de iniciar esta ponencia y con mucho gusto atenderé después sus... Ay, perdón. Ok. El estudio de conceptos básicos de la filosofía. ¿Ustedes ven bien la proyección? Perdonen. ¿Están viendo bien toda la pantalla? La presentación se ve... Ok, perfecto.
Muy bien, sí.
Bien. El estudio de conceptos básicos de la filosofía y su método de análisis deberían de ser material natural en la formación de las personas educadoras y de las personas estudiantes de todos los niveles y disciplinas. Todas las ramas de la filosofía son esenciales. Hoy nos enfocaremos en el papel de la epistemología en el ejercicio educativo, aunque a la sombra de ella, como sabemos, están asuntos éticos, metafísicos, estéticos y lógicos insoslayables. La educación como fenómeno humano es inevitable. Esta es la diversidad está en la diversidad de intercambios sociales cotidianos, en lo expuesto a través de las redes, la interacción académica y en lo que se busca por interés o curiosidad personal. Lo que nos interesa en esta intervención es lo que se desarrolla a través de la educación formal en 2 ejes: las propuestas curriculares en los niveles de la educación primaria y secundaria y la propuesta curricular de la formación universitaria. El tratamiento del tema no pretende ser exhaustivo, pero sí invitar a algunas reflexiones en torno de cómo se construye y analiza el conocimiento en esos ámbitos. Primero que todo, quiero hacer un poco una breve historia, una reseña de los perfiles educativos que heredamos, porque esos demarcan también cómo se va a apreciar los temas epistemológicos y cómo también influyen en el sistema educativo. La educación costarricense, como muchas otras alrededor del mundo, refleja la influencia del pensamiento liberal y positivista de finales del siglo XIX. Esta fue una época de grandes cambios en el contexto socioeconómico y político, y donde la élite gubernamental de nuestro país importó ideas educativas europeas, y entre las que predominaron las desarrolladas en Gran Bretaña, Francia y España. En la parte administrativa se adoptó las regulaciones bajo una educación gratuita, financiada por el Estado y universal, es decir, dispuesta para todo ciudadano indistintamente de su origen social o su género. En la parte educativa se aspiraba al ideal de la ilustración, una cultura para todos y una didáctica más sensible a las necesidades de los alumnos y sus edades. Estas tendencias se fueron desarrollando lentamente y en general dieron lugar a cambios positivos en lo social. Metodológicamente, sin embargo, predominaron las técnicas de las escuelas confesionales, es decir, una educación bancaria de repetición de contenidos y poca interacción del alumnado, que incluso entrado el siglo XX recibía castigos físicos. Los deseos por una educación general básica toma tiempo, pues Costa Rica tiene grandes obstáculos para la formación de maestras y maestros. En general, en el siglo XIX, a pesar de sus reformas, es muy precario en ofertas de formación educativa. Una gran parte de los maestros son empíricos o bien contratados del extranjero. Hay una formación básica en la Casa de Enseñanza Santo Tomás, que después pasa a ser la Universidad de Santo Tomás, a inicios del siglo XIX. Después se dieron algunas reformas a partir de 1849 en la administración de José María Castro Madrid, quien fundó una institución normal para formar maestras y un consejo de instrucción pública, pero que duró escasos 4 años. Ante la escasez de educadores, como bien reporta el historiador Iván Molina, la respuesta más efectiva fue aplicar el método lancasteriano, mediante el cual los alumnos mayores y más avanzados enseñaban a los menores. El primer colegio que abre sus puertas en Costa Rica es el San Luis Gonzaga, en Cartago en 1869, de la mano de los hermanos Juan y Valeriano Fernández Ferraz, de origen español y hombres de una gran cultura, que fueron emblemáticos de la educación racionalista y humanista. De hecho, el colegio se crea realmente en 1842, pero por falta de educadores y de infraestructura, se pospone su apertura casi por 20 años más. Después viene la apertura del Liceo de Costa Rica, en 1887, para el cual el gobierno contrata a 3 profesores de origen suizo, Luis Chonot, William Philippin y Pablo Violet. Se completó la plantilla de profesores con docentes provenientes de Cuba, Guatemala y España. Y también se contrataron costarricenses, pero que no eran docentes en sí, pero eran ingenieros que podían instruir en matemáticas o artistas que podían enseñar canto o dibujo. Al cierre de la Universidad de Santo Tomás en 1888, la precariedad de la educación del sistema educativo costarricense se recrudeció y a duras penas se va restableciendo con instituciones sueltas que imparten carreras como Derecho, Farmacia y Teología. Por su parte, la preocupación por la formación de docentes prevalece por lo que se reabren 2 escuelas normales, una en San José y la más emblemática, la Escuela Normal de Heredia, en 1914, bajo el gobierno de Alfredo González Flores. Este es un centro que marca una sustancial diferencia en la formación de docentes y donde imparten muchos intelectuales llamados del Olimpo, como Roberto Brenes Mesén, Joaquín García Monge y Omar Dengo, y que fomentan una instrucción liberal, racionalista y que procuran mostrar los últimos avances del conocimiento científico. Debemos de recordar, por ejemplo, todo el dilema que pasó Roberto Brenes Mesén cuando defendió la teoría de la evolución, ¿verdad? Fue hasta apedreado en la calle. Fue una época difícil para plantear ideas diferentes. Aún así, prosiguió en su oficio. Finalmente se va del país, pero eso, digamos, un intento en medio de lo que estaba en el ambiente. La oferta educativa no es uniforme, claro está, por ser una sociedad de poder centralista, de manera que los mayores desarrollos educativos, que son modestos en sí, se dan en la meseta central. Algunos docentes devienen de la clase oligárquica cafetalera que pudieron costearse una educación fuera del país, en Europa, en Chile o en Guatemala. Y un poco más tarde se envían algunos pocos a especializarse, como Carmen Lira, que trae las ideas de María Montessori a Costa Rica y funda la primera institución de educación preescolar en 1926. Aquí hay que recalcar que María Montessori también es seguidora de ese panorama, digamos, empirista científico y lo traslada a la educación inicial o preescolar, que es muy importante también eventualmente para desarrollar métodos, ¿verdad? En fin, la educación costarricense emerge entonces en medio de la precariedad. Ay, disculpen, pequeño accidente aquí, gatuno. La educación costarricense emerge entonces en medio de la precariedad y el tradicionalismo católico, pero con algunas aristas rebeldes y progresistas representadas por estos educadores de la escuela normal y algunos de los docentes extranjeros. En esta línea más progresista se encuentra favorable una instrucción basada en el racionalismo y el método científico muy apegado a la tradición positivista, y un humanismo inspirado por grandes figuras de la tradición filosófica como Rousseau, Schelling, Pestalozzi y también el krausismo español. Hay que destacar que tanto los docentes nacionales como extranjeros tenían por lo general una educación y una vocación filosófica. La instrucción educativa no solo se valoraba desde su aspecto instrumental y productivo, sino también desde su aspecto trascendental y espiritual, más allá que fuera un fin religioso o no. Y esto quedó muy claro en la influencia de los hermanos Fernández Ferraz. Para 1940 llega la apertura de la Universidad de Costa Rica y Rodrigo Facio tiene que ir a contratar docentes de varias partes del mundo para estructurar las distintas facultades. La escuela normal para entonces ha desaparecido y se ha transformado en escuela de pedagogía, que es parte de la universidad, pero que sin embargo no gradúa especialistas en educación. Es Emma Gamboa, especialista en educación primaria y en filosofía, la que de manera vehemente lucha por la calificación profesional de los educadores, porque hasta entonces no tenían un grado, eran simplemente un diplomado. No solo con el objetivo de mejorar sus calidades profesionales, sino también salariales y de reconocimiento social. Sus esfuerzos cristalizan hasta 1958, año en que se abre la Facultad de Educación. En la década siguiente se logra graduar bachilleres en enseñanza primaria y hasta inicios de los 80 se empiezan a graduar bachilleres en las distintas ramas de la educación secundaria. O sea, ahí había ciertos intentos o graduaciones, pero hasta ahí es que, digamos, se formaliza. Emma Gamboa fue becada por el gobierno de Costa Rica para seguir estudios de posgrado en los Estados Unidos, donde se identifica con el pensamiento filosófico y educativo de John Dewey. Eso hace que promocione las ideas de la escuela pragmatista y funde la escuela laboratorio, como institución adyacente a la universidad y que perfile una formación basada en la experimentación en las personas docentes y estudiantes. Es notable en muchos de sus escritos la influencia de Dewey, pero también la idea de la educación como algo liberador y más allá de un bien utilitario. En palabras de Emma Gamboa, abro comillas, la función universal de la educación es la de servir al mejoramiento humano. Esto le da a la educación sus bases filosóficas. La sola reflexión de que la escuela ha sido creada por la sociedad como agencia inteligente de progreso nos lleva a la conclusión de que ella tiene una responsabilidad social. Esta se acrecienta en presencia de las condiciones de época en que vivimos. Cierro comillas. Esta labor educativa se va a complementar a partir de los años 70 con las contribuciones de la Universidad Nacional, fundada en 1973, y la Universidad Estatal a Distancia en 1977. Con los años, la Universidad Nacional va a gestar un perfil educativo más crítico y contestatario. Señal de ello fue la gestión de propuestas educativas desde las ideas de Paulo Freire y la pedagogía crítica. Por su parte, a partir de los años 80, surgen diferentes universidades privadas que dan carreras de educación, la mayoría con un perfil de especialización instrumental, administración, pedagogía general, entre otros. En medio de estas influencias tan variadas, los planes de estudio de estas universidades generalmente mantienen un perfil formalizante, basado en el aprendizaje de bases históricas, metodológicas y conceptuales tradicionales. Desde los años 80 se empezó a dar un giro hacia el pensamiento constructivista como material conceptual, pero ha permeado muy poco la parte metodológica y evaluativa todavía entrado el siglo XXI. Hay que reconocer que ha habido diferentes intentos de modificaciones, pero estos procesos resultan sumamente burocratizados y centralistas, por lo menos en las universidades públicas, lo que hace los cambios muy lentos y en algunos casos prácticamente ha congelado muchos planes de estudio por décadas, a pesar de tener profesionales preparados para prácticas innovadoras. Su impacto se da, pero en el aspecto de su propia práctica docente, no alcanza a realizar cambios estructurales. Esto está reseñado con detalle justamente en el último informe del estado de la educación, donde se tratan los principales problemas de la educación superior y uno de los problemas internos es justamente, y abro comillas, un complejo modelo para tomar decisiones. Cierro comillas y abro, y también un celoso manejo de la información o área de conocimiento entre colegas y escuelas o del resto del sector científico nacional. Esta forma de proceder es contraria a la colaboración abierta y el trabajo inter, multi y transdisciplinario que se observan en los ecosistemas de innovación maduros. Y voy a pasar entonces a hablar ahora de otros detalles importantes de esta charla. Los planes de estudio y la ausencia de propuestas epistemológicas. La tendencia positivista que se mencionó como representativa del sistema educativo costarricense es un reflejo del contexto educativo mundial. Después de todo, la ciencia logra imponerse en el siglo XIX a base de resultados extraordinarios como una forma de ver el mundo y de construir conocimiento. Este modelo de pensamiento traslada la educación a través de las incursiones de la psicología experimental, que trata de consolidarse como ciencia, adoptando la estructura del método científico. En esta transacción es notable el papel de Watson, fundador de la psicología conductista, y que establece que la psicología debía ocuparse del estudio de los hechos observables de la conducta humana. El modelo positivista deriva en una racionalización matemática del hecho educativo, evaluación cuantitativa, y una enseñanza utilitaria, programas que satisfagan objetivos previamente estudiados y medidos para la producción material, es lo que después se calificaría como el paradigma conductista y que lleva a identificar el sistema educativo con el sistema industrial capitalista. A propósito de esto, la educadora y filósofa Flora Salas indica lo siguiente. Consecuente con los fundamentos filosóficos, la pedagogía conductista elabora didácticas que permiten el logro de objetivos determinados cuyo fin es moldear la conducta en función de los intereses sociales. Además, como su método de enseñanza se basa en objetivos, estos pueden ser evaluados en forma cuantitativa y de manera progresiva, yendo de lo más simple hasta lo más complejo. Resultados numéricos permitirán la promoción o reprobación de los estudiantes con base en notas basadas en medidas estadísticamente validadas. Entre las ventajas que esta pedagogía ofrece están que se parte de supuestos generales en donde se espera que todos los individuos aprendan igual a través de metodologías iguales. El material didáctico que se diseña debe funcionar en todos los sectores y regiones de igual modo. Es posible establecer estadísticamente estándares de excelencia y las escalas son aplicables bajo el criterio de toda población se comporta de forma normal. 4. Las excepciones pueden ser tratadas de manera específica, tendencias sub- y supranormales. Esta pedagogía tiene como ventaja adicional el abaratamiento de los costes educativos por alumno, ya que la capacitación docente, así como el material didáctico y las condiciones materiales de aprendizaje, pueden ser estandarizados. Además, permite el abordaje masivo de las necesidades de educación. Esto, como ustedes podrán contemplar, es una cuestión que tiene una mezcla de factores positivos de manejo administrativo, incluso didáctico, pero también grandes problemas también a nivel pedagógico, ¿verdad? Y sobre todo de valoración del individuo como aprendiente. Entonces, en estas cosas, precisamente, pues, perfilamos lo que se da, pero tenemos que tomar en cuenta esos dos, digamos, dimensiones de la situación. En este contexto, y sin admisión de un análisis exhaustivo, al revisar los planes de estudio de las carreras universitarias, no se advierten propuestas explícitas de análisis epistemológicos que reten directamente este proceso educativo en la mayoría de ellos. Más bien se han naturalizado y profundizado en menoscabo de una educación de contexto y rescate de las líneas humanistas que han pujado por existir a través de los años en medio del paradigma conductista. A la par de este aparece también el paradigma constructivista, que justamente ha pujado, ¿verdad?, desde los años 90, sobre todo 80, 90, pero que todavía no ha calado totalmente de forma estructural. Dentro de este esquema que hemos mencionado, hay otra preocupación respecto hasta dónde se dan las oportunidades para revisar cómo se construye el conocimiento específico en cada una de las disciplinas, cómo interactúan los factores sociales e ideológicos en los cursos que se escogen para formar determinados profesionales. De igual forma, se hace necesario revisar los libros de texto. Bueno, aquí ya les voy a pasar. De igual forma, se hace necesario revisar los libros de texto como recurso formativo de una perspectiva de conocimiento. El uso de ciertas metáforas o términos pueden impactar la forma que se asume toda una realidad, como muy bien lo han señalado en su momento Lakoff y Foucault. El conocimiento científico en sí generalmente se expone muchas veces despojado de su contexto histórico, en una serie de personajes de cuyas acciones solo se remarcan aquellas que llevaron a la consecución de sus descubrimientos o inventos, sin registrar sus intentos fallidos y los obstáculos técnicos que tuvieron. Esto suele hacerse desde la filosofía y desde algunos científicos que se han preocupado por cuestionarse su quehacer, pero no siempre se traslada a la formación profesional. El filósofo uruguayo Pablo Meloño lo indica muy bien en su ensayo Thomas Kuhn y la educación científica, donde analiza una beta poco estudiada de Kuhn, la cual es su visión de la educación científica y que pareciera representarse muy bien en la forma de presentar la ciencia en algunos contextos actuales. Para Kuhn, las revoluciones científicas reorganizan las categorías con las que los científicos se enfrentan a su experiencia y adoptan un nuevo paradigma, el cual es una especie de iluminación nueva de la realidad, a la que hay que plegarse para darle sentido al mundo. Hay que tomar en cuenta que para Kuhn, dice Meloño, la adopción de un nuevo paradigma no es el resultado de una evolución entre teorías basada en la lógica o la experiencia, sino la consecuencia de un cambio de gestalt, de un proceso abrupto y apoyado antes por la intuición que en la lógica, en que el científico súbitamente transforma su visión en base a los códigos del nuevo paradigma. Para Kuhn, ante la aparición de un nuevo paradigma, la historia que precede respecto a la construcción del conocimiento anterior a esta desaparece. El nuevo paradigma produce una deshistorización y una deformación ideológica, y esto crea una narración imaginaria, siendo los principales vehículos de difusión e inculcación los libros científicos de texto, las obras de divulgación científica y las teorías filosóficas de la ciencia. De cierta forma, es inevitable la influencia de un nuevo paradigma en la conformación de los textos, pero lo curioso es, acota Meloño, que Kuhn acepta este factor como natural, pues le da sentido a la realidad de los científicos como un continuo coherente, y es lo que él llama la invisibilidad de las revoluciones. Esta complejidad ideológica rara vez es revisada por los que hacen ciencia, señala Meloño, y esto nos permite ver la complejidad de desarrollo científico a través de las culturas y las percepciones particulares de las distintas disciplinas. Y no solo es una cuestión de discurso expuesto en la literatura científica, sino también de la narrativa expresada en las imágenes que acompañan y complementan la construcción del determinado conocimiento. Gerard Fouré lo comenta muy bien en su ensayo Cómo se elabora el conocimiento, en donde dedica un apartado a las representaciones y donde indica lo necesarias que son para la comunicación y manipulación del conocimiento. Pues las representaciones no imitan lo real, se trata de un tercer objeto, como un mapa de ruta. Su valor no es absoluto, es decir, sin contexto, sino relativo a los proyectos y a un contexto. Sin embargo, como bien acota el mismo Fouré, algunos ven la representación como un espejo de la realidad. Este es el sentido más extendido y transmite la ideología de muchos investigadores que asumen una ideología positivista empírica. Esta perspectiva sitúa el origen de la representación en el deseo de imitar lo real más que en representarlo. Por ello es importante trabajar en concientizar sobre las representaciones dadas en la cotidianidad, que generalmente se asumen de forma ingenua. Mapas, estadísticas, esquemas. Sobre esto advierte muy bien el fotógrafo científico Guillermo Cárdenas en un artículo llamado Las imágenes de la ciencia. Detrás de lo que vemos, dice Cárdenas, o creemos ver, hay varias capas de interpretación. La realidad no es directamente accesible a los sentidos. Y continúa citando a Peter Krieger. No existe una ciencia pura, abstracta, estrictamente lógica, expresada en palabras y cifras neutrales. Casi todos los resultados de la investigación científica pasan por el filtro de la expresión y la presentación visual, en gráficas ilustrativas, en fotografías microscópicas o en configuraciones matemáticas en la pantalla de la computadora. Aún más, a decir que este historiador del arte, tales mediadores visuales de la ciencia no solo ilustran los contenidos de la investigación, sino que los enfocan, aclaran, agudizan e incluso los manipulan. Esta es una reflexión que invita por igual a una reflexión epistemológica, como estética y eventualmente ética, también sobre las representaciones del conocimiento, porque tienen gran impacto en esa formación de la construcción del conocimiento. Ahora pues me voy a referir, bueno, a experiencias ya aterrizadas en otro contexto que no es necesariamente el universitario, sino en algo que puede suceder antes de ello. Teoría del conocimiento o filosofía antes de los estudios universitarios. La oportunidad de reflexionar sobre la construcción de conocimiento no debe dejarse solamente al ámbito universitario. Tal vez sea demasiado tarde. Hay que fomentar un escepticismo razonable sobre el conocimiento desde los primeros años de escolaridad. Se puede iniciar con ejercicios muy simples, pero reveladores. Solicitar que dibujen una persona que hace ciencia. En las muchas veces que he solicitado esto a niños y niñas, adolescentes, inclusive estudiantes universitarios y colegas educadores, casi siempre han representado a un hombre blanco, con anteojos, con gabacha, un poco como este, y en medio de un laboratorio. O bien se puede solicitar que de forma rápida mencionen 3 científicos famosos. ¿Y qué sucede? Mencionan generalmente hombres europeos, a pesar de tener entre nosotros gente sobresaliente, hombres y mujeres. Y a pesar que buena parte de los que son mediatizados, como los premios Nobel, son personas de Medio Oriente, Asia o Latinoamérica. O sea, generalmente hay un enfoque, ¿verdad?, de un solo modelo. Esto es algo simple, pero potente para problematizar la forma en que visualizamos la construcción del pensamiento científico. Igualmente, se les puede cuestionar a estudiantes de cualquier nivel los aspectos representados y no representados por un determinado mapa o ilustración de los libros de texto. Todavía, y recalco todavía, en libros de texto que hablan de la teoría de la evolución se sigue presentando el esquema del simio que se hace hombre y de etnia caucásica. Un poco, este es un montón. Es más, pueden solicitar hacer la exploración tecnológica. Pongan teoría de la evolución y la mayor parte de las entradas de imagen de Google no hay una sola mujer o en todo caso un hombre de etnia no caucásica. Se agregan la palabra mujer, sale un par de escalas y en todas las mujeres sale vestida. No hay duda que puede ser interesante e instructivo epistemológicamente hablando. Les animo a todos también a preguntar aquí mismo, en el ámbito universitario, a ver cuántos estudiantes saben cuántos centros de investigación contiene la Universidad de Costa Rica. Generalmente no saben, y lo que es más gracioso es que miran con sorpresa que hay institutos de investigación en artes o en filosofía. En mi carrera como docente de la filosofía he tenido dos oportunidades que me han demostrado que existen muchas alternativas educativas concretas para llevar a cabo cuestionamientos epistemológicos. Una ha sido con el programa de filosofía para niños y jóvenes, que cuenta con una serie de materiales y estrategias para trabajar desde infantes de educación inicial hasta jóvenes de secundaria. En general, se fomenta una reflexión filosófica desde la experiencia de los propios estudiantes y son ellos los que van desarrollando las temáticas. La persona docente debe asistirles como facilitadora, solicitándoles clarificaciones sobre lo que expresan y conjeturas. Por ejemplo, recuerdo un caso de unas niñas de tercer grado que discutían hasta qué punto una caricatura podía ser algo real y examinaron poco a poco las distintas dimensiones. Es real en tanto caricatura impresa, pero lo que representa es fantasioso. O lo que representa es real en tanto está en la mente de alguien, porque la mente lo asume como real por un momento. Las caricaturas son reales para algunos niños. Algo existe en tanto yo creo que existe, etc. También los cuestionamientos pueden extenderse al margen de la realidad del cuerpo y la definición de mi persona. Por ejemplo, Pixie, una de las personajes de las historias del programa, se pregunta en algún momento si ella y su cuerpo son lo mismo, si las partes de su cuerpo le pertenecen como le pertenecen sus pensamientos. Otra experiencia ha sido dentro del programa de Bachillerato Internacional, programa que se imparte en el país desde 1991 y que cuenta con un eje central, como eje central la materia de teoría del conocimiento. Esta además supone una transversalidad, es decir, que se fomente una reflexión constante de la construcción del conocimiento en todas las otras 6 materias que lleva el estudiantado. La materia tiene los siguientes objetivos generales: desarrollar una comprensión de cómo los individuos y las comunidades construyen el conocimiento, desarrollar un interés por la diversidad y la riqueza de perspectivas culturales y una comprensión de los supuestos personales e ideológicos contenidos en nuestros conocimientos. El programa no propone contenidos teóricos definidos, sino más bien una serie de temas y preguntas atinentes a la teoría del conocimiento, que pueden ser abordados con bastante flexibilidad por la persona docente. Algunas de esas preguntas podrían ser: ¿es posible pensar sin lenguaje? ¿Pueden explicarse todas las cosas a través del lenguaje? ¿A quién pertenece el conocimiento? ¿Tener más conocimientos implica que podemos hacer mejores juicios éticos? ¿Puede una obra literaria explicar la psicología humana mejor que las ciencias? La experiencia es muy interesante, pero también se da cuenta del peso que tienen los hábitos de pensamiento que les preceden. Hay preguntas simples como, por ejemplo, ¿qué relación puede haber entre las artes y el desarrollo del conocimiento? Y aunque el estudiantado se ha servido por 11 años previos de libros ilustrados para conocer un átomo o ver un mapa, les cuesta muchísimo dar crédito que el arte no solo es para entretenerse, que el arte puede servir para informar. O como indicábamos antes, para darle forma a ciertas ideas o conceptos. Además de este centro reflexivo que provoca la materia de teoría del conocimiento, hay espacio para escoger entre varias humanidades y artes. El proceso didáctico de esta propuesta es muy rico y valioso, pero el proceso evaluativo, que en un inicio era muy personalizado, se ha tornado una empresa ajena, estandarizada al extremo, que ha caído en el paradigma conductista que comentábamos con anterioridad. Este problema es representativo de esa realidad compleja que se vive en los sistemas educativos, donde conviven posturas positivistas y constructivistas al mismo tiempo. Por su parte, es importante señalar que este programa es practicado por una minoría en el país. Está en 14 colegios privados y en 20 colegios públicos que lo han podido implementar gracias al apoyo de la empresa privada y al ministerio, y lo han hecho con muchísimo éxito. Pero es todavía una experiencia pequeña.
5 minutitos más, profesora.
Listo, gracias. Yo creo que me alcanza.
Perfecto.
Esto contrasta con la tendencia a la educación costarricense de los últimos 20 años, donde se ha ido tecnocratizando cada vez más la educación. La educación secundaria tiene la posibilidad de diversificarse en colegios académicos, ambientalistas, deportistas, humanísticos, artísticos, científicos y técnicos. Estos últimos, desde el 2010, en el gobierno de Laura Chinchilla, han tenido un crecimiento exponencial, en detrimento de los colegios llamados académicos. De unos más o menos 32 colegios se pasó a unos 135 colegios, del 2010 a la fecha. Esto se reporta en el 6º informe del estado de la educación. Si bien es importante a nivel vocacional tener una oferta surtida y que complemente el desarrollo de una sociedad, estos cada vez más se enfocan en una formación especializada y desmembrada de una educación crítica y humanística. Esto en tanto está abocada a afinar destrezas para cumplir un objetivo laboral y ofrece pocas oportunidades para examinar y replantearse su propio quehacer. Algo similar ocurre en los colegios científicos y experimentales bilingües, que a diferencia de los académicos no reciben ninguna lección de filosofía. Lo más cercano en algunos casos, y ya muy reducido, porque no es en todos los colegios, es un breve curso de ética profesional en los colegios técnicos. Y si bien ese acercamiento a la filosofía en general puede ser muy necesario y constructivo, no lo es menos un acercamiento a la epistemología o a la teoría del conocimiento. Hoy mucho se habla del auge de la educación STEM, acrónimo de las materias de Science, Technology, Engineering and Mathematics, o de la alfabetización científica. Lo curioso es que una de las cualidades que se apremia a tener para funcionar en ese encuadre es el pensamiento crítico, y no se suele percibir esta habilidad como algo propio de la filosofía. Ya lo decía el propio filósofo John Dewey, que la filosofía deja de ser un mecanismo para abordar los problemas de los filósofos y se convierte en un método cultivado por filósofos para abordar los problemas de la humanidad. El filósofo mexicano Gabriel Vargas Lozano, un gran promotor de la enseñanza de la filosofía, menciona acertadamente que observamos una situación altamente contradictoria. Por un lado, en virtud de los graves problemas que aquejan a la humanidad, la filosofía como sistema de razón es más necesaria que nunca. Sin embargo, por otro lado, existen tendencias poderosas que buscan reducirla, limitarla e inclusive anularla. Vale la pena hacerse aquí las preguntas que hace unos años nos presentaba la educadora brasileña Vera Candau. Como educadores y educadoras, ¿qué sociedad queremos ayudar a construir? ¿Qué perspectiva de formación humana, qué horizonte formativo le ofrecemos al sujeto que está en proceso de formación? El mismo Vargas Lozano indica que muy bien que a partir de las últimas décadas del siglo XX y la primera mitad del siglo XXI hemos asistido a la destrucción de cualquier pandilla y la sustitución por una serie de instrucciones orientadas al productivismo y al consumismo sin intentar siquiera la formación de una concepción armónica e integral del ser humano y su relación con la naturaleza. Asistimos a un proceso de construcción de los valores anteriores, pero sin la conformación de un nuevo horizonte de sentido. Sobre la situación actual de tecnificación de la educación y el abandono de las humanidades, Martha Nussbaum también se pronuncia con contundencia en su ensayo Sin fines de lucro, donde señala claramente que no hay evidencias de que un crecimiento económico necesariamente refleje en un país un beneficio social. Y ella pone muy claro el ejemplo de Sudáfrica. Dice Martha Nussbaum, producir crecimiento económico no equivale a producir democracia, ni a generar una población sana, comprometida y formada que disponga de oportunidades para una buena calidad de vida en todas las clases sociales. En ese mismo ensayo, Nussbaum es enfática para revertir ese proceso, que un elemento primordial es replantearse la estructura de la educación y en ella incluir de alguna forma la pedagogía socrática, que fomente, entre otras, ciertas aptitudes para el desarrollo de criterios para analizar y comprender los retos políticos del contexto social en que se viven. En esta misma línea, Matthew Lehman, el creador del programa de filosofía para niños y jóvenes, asevera lo siguiente según lo cita el filósofo José Marina. Lo importante es el juicio y es sobre este punto sobre el que deben versar nuestros esfuerzos. Nuestros jóvenes deben saber distinguir lo que es auténtico y lo que no es, lo que es profundo y lo que es superficial, lo que está justificado o lo injustificado. Si la escuela enseñara a los jóvenes el ejercicio de un juicio mejor, esto les protegería contra los que quieren convertirlos a sus prejuicios y manipularlos adoctrinándoles. Nuestros jóvenes serían mejores trabajadores, mejores consumidores y mejores ciudadanos. Es justamente, ya estoy por terminar, ante esta urgencia de desarrollo de pensamiento crítico y el análisis que merece el desarrollo del conocimiento, que me parece imperativo que a nivel de la formación universitaria se implementen más cursos y espacios de reflexión sobre temas epistemológicos. Por lo que conozco más de cerca, ¿verdad? Ya se han dado cambios importantes en algunas carreras de educación. A nivel de bachillerato se están exigiendo cursos de enseñanza en la enseñanza de la educación inicial, en enseñanza de las ciencias naturales, que acaba de tener toda una reestructuración, y prácticamente en todos los posgrados tienen algún curso. Por su parte, urge mejorar el alcance de la filosofía en los niveles de educación primaria y secundaria. En este ámbito se va lento, pero hay alguna luz de esperanza. En el Ministerio de Educación Pública se ha hecho un gran esfuerzo en los últimos años por revisar las propuestas educativas sobre el tema de habilidades y está contemplando ya de una manera más formal un plan piloto para introducir el programa de filosofía para niños en algunas escuelas públicas. Esto ya está en su etapa final de aprobación ante el Consejo Superior de Educación. Vamos a ver si pasa esa etapa. Después de muchos años de estar trabajando con el paradigma constructivista, sin muchos cambios cualitativos, pareciera que al fin se da un paso hacia un cambio significativo. Estimo importante entonces seguir en esta ruta y hacer los esfuerzos pertinentes para recolocar la filosofía en los espacios que había tenido en los esquemas educativos y en la formación de profesionales. Para ello es importante que en conjunto, personas involucradas con el desarrollo de la filosofía y la educación, trabajemos en conjunto para procurar cambios cualitativos en apreciación de trabajo científico y la conciencia social que éste conlleva.
Listo,
y para terminar, termino con esta frase nada más de José Ortega y Gasset: siempre que enseñes, enseña a la vez a dudar de lo que enseñes. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchas gracias, profesora Arroyo, por la interesante intervención. Abrimos el espacio en unos 12 minutos aproximadamente para que quienes están con nosotros participen consultando, intercambiando algún punto de vista con la profesora Arroyo. Lo pueden hacer escribiendo en el chat o levantando la reacción de la manita y se le escucha. Entonces, estamos a la espera. Queda abierto el espacio para que interactúen con la profesora.
¿Se puede hacer alguna pregunta?
Por supuesto, hágala.
Por supuesto, adelante.
Primero que nada, felicitaciones por el resumen histórico. Excelente. Por tu visión crítica. Excelente. Sin embargo, hay cuestiones, bueno, en general estoy de acuerdo. Hay algunos puntos en los que discrepo.
Claro.
Uno de ellos es el abaratamiento que mencionaste del sistema conductista. Al contrario, el sistema conductista es mucho más caro. Te digo porque yo como docente trabajé con ambos, ¿verdad? Con el conductismo y con el constructivismo. Es muchísimo más barato el constructivismo, en el que puedes usar materiales como hojas de árboles, barro con los niños. No necesitan ni siquiera comprar absolutamente nada. Entonces, mi experiencia es que el abaratamiento es al contrario, es en el sistema constructivista, que además nos permite adelantar a los niños 3 años de edad, cosa que no soñó Piaget, ¿verdad? Un tributo al gran Piaget. Ni siquiera soñó que pudiéramos adelantar 3 años en el desarrollo intelectual de los niños. Y en eso pues difiero. Otra cuestión importante de mencionar es que en los años 90 ya estaba el curso de epistemología educativa en todas las escuelas de educación. Yo di algunas veces ese curso, era teórico práctico, muy crítico, muy crítico, por supuesto, con una gran base filosófica, por supuesto, pero también muy práctico. Era teórico práctico en los 90, ¿verdad? Que dimos ese curso.
Sí, Marisela, no.
Pero tenés toda la razón que desapareció, tenés toda la razón que desapareció, ¿verdad? Porque en Costa Rica desaparecen las cosas mejores, yo no entiendo por qué, ¿verdad? Tal vez porque la gente no logra, como bien lo decís muy bien en tu ponencia, la gente tal vez no logra dar ese salto sistematizado, cualitativo, para lograr cambios en este país. Cambiar es algo muy difícil, muy difícil.
No, Marisela, no.
Muchas gracias, doña Marisela. Vamos a dar la palabra
no,
a la
es que,
profesora para
es que no he terminado, perdón.
Al mito más, adelante.
Sí, no, yo sé. Primero que nada está excelente, además, la exposición.
No, es que tiene mucha razón y quisiera replicarte ahí, nada más. Eso
ok. Dijiste otras cuestiones, como que aquí se ha practicado el constructivismo, difiero absolutamente en esto. Se ha intentado copiar, eso es diferente, copiar a gente que sabe, copiar actividades buenas. Y se ha intentado copiar en el Ministerio de Educación, pero no tiene la formación epistemológica. Ellos no tienen la formación epistemológica y muchísimo menos constructivista para conseguir ni siquiera un asomo de constructivismo. Entonces, esa es la triste realidad, ¿verdad? El MEP no dominó ni ofreció nunca una visión epistemológica de la educación. No conozco escuelas constructivistas en Costa Rica. Nosotros tuvimos una escuela constructivista que la abrimos en el 93, la cerramos en el 2005. Y era completamente constructivista, incluso hemos compartido ideas con Finlandia, por ejemplo, pero en Costa Rica ha sido mucho más difícil compartir esas ideas, ¿verdad? Esa es la experiencia que me parece que ahora en todo lo demás estoy totalmente de acuerdo, aquí apunté miles de cosas en las que estoy de acuerdo, ¿no?
Muchas gracias, doña Marisela, para
sí,
poder darle
gracias.
chance a otros que quieren participar. Gracias, profesora Katia.
Gracias.
Sí,
Gracias.
no, más bien quiero decirte, Marisela, que tus observaciones son muy atinadas y yo creo que amplía, ¿verdad? Como es una charla, uno compacta muchas cosas, no puede decir todos los detalles, pero porque sí es muy cierto que la situación del sistema conductista, cuando se habla en el trabajo masivo, es cuando resulta su abaratamiento. Pero digamos, no en la parte cotidiana, porque ahí tendríamos varias cosas que discutir y tienes razón tu observación. En cuanto a los cursos de epistemología, lamentablemente han sido de forma intermitente. Y aquí voy a recalcar una cosa, porque no hay especialistas. Entonces, eso es una cosa que yo apuntaría, ¿verdad? En conjunto entre la Escuela de Filosofía y Educación, que hay que formar gente que tenga mayor potestad sobre este terreno como vos, por ejemplo. Entonces, eso ha escaseado, no se ha visualizado esto. Y respecto al constructivismo, ha sido una lucha eterna. Está en el discurso, pero cuesta muchísimo en la práctica. Entonces, esto se ha quedado precisamente, por eso digo, en intentos que son a veces personalistas. O sea, la gente incurre en sus cursos con cambios, innovaciones y se dirigen por esa dirección. Pero ahí hay un punto importante que ha señalado. ¿Quién los ha formado? Cuesta mucho desmantelar el esquema positivista, empirista, conductista de nuestra forma de educar para pasar al otro esquema. Y eso toma tiempo y formación. Entonces, ahí estamos, paso a paso, ¿verdad? Pero eso sería lo que yo diría, Marisela, y muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, profesora. Le damos la palabra a don Clever. ¿Tiene la palabra?
Gracias, buenas tardes a los organizadores. Saludo a la ponencia. Bueno, como antecedente normal te cuento, Katy, que yo he elaborado en todos los sistemas educativos en el Ecuador y quiero plantearte lo siguiente. Me parece que hay una confusión de los paradigmas positivista a nivel general o a nivel exportado de las ciencias naturales o las ciencias sociales y trasladados a la educación. Ahí veo que se hace una mezcla con el conductismo visto desde la psicología. Entonces, eso que ha hecho que no tenga claro yo cuál es el objeto de estudio de la educación. Si yo no tengo claro lo que es el objeto de la educación, difícilmente mi posición epistemológica y metodológica va a tener coherencia. Entonces eso ha pasado a nivel mundial, eso está pasando. ¿Qué está sucediendo ahora en la investigación? Por ser netamente técnicos, nos olvidamos de los fundamentos filosóficos, epistemológicos y metodológicos y nos dedicamos solamente a lo técnico. Entonces a mí me parece que hay que definir claramente que no podemos utilizar los paradigmas generales en la educación, porque la educación tiene sus paradigmas propios, así como las ciencias naturales y las ciencias sociales. Otro elemento también que se planteó es que se hablaba de todos los niveles y determinando la edad evolutiva, los paradigmas o la posición epistemológica va a ser diferente. En la universidad va a ser diferente a lo que suceda en la educación básica. No sé cómo se llama acá, allá en Costa Rica, pero aquí se llama educación básica.
Nosotros
Esa es
tenemos
mi...
ese término también.
muchas gracias por permitirme intervenir a los organizadores. Muy gentiles.
Muchas
Usted, don
gracias, don
Clever.
Clever. Claro que sí. No, es todo un tema, esto de los paradigmas, y nunca se dan en estado puro, porque justamente son ejercidos por seres humanos y nosotros en la interacción los vamos transformando, pero hay un predominio. Eso es un poco lo que uno observa, ¿verdad? En fin.
Bien, si no hay ninguna intervención, nos aprestaríamos a la siguiente conferencia. No
Sí.
sé si alguien más desea. Por razones de tiempo solo tenemos 3 minutitos más antes de que el otro conferencista aparezca. Pues bueno, profesora Katia, ha sido un gusto verle nuevamente y la participación exquisita. Muchísimas gracias de parte de los organizadores del primer Congreso de Lógica, Epistemología y Metodología. Pueden seguir, como decían en el chat, todas estas conferencias están en YouTube y pueden en el Instituto de Investigaciones Filosóficas. A todos los presentes, una cordial invitación para la siguiente conferencia de parte del profesor William Lane Craig. Y a usted, profesora, nuevamente muchísimas gracias. Con permiso y buenas tardes a todos los demás.
Muchas gracias a todos. Que pasen muy buena tarde. Hasta
Muchas
luego.
gracias. Hasta
Gracias.
luego. Chao, chao.
Chao.
Juan. Chao, chao, teacher.
Chao.
Regresaremos en 9 minutos para comenzar con la conferencia del profesor William Lane Craig, la cual será pregrabada. Entonces proyectaremos el video a partir de las 3 de la tarde. Y a partir de las 3:40 de la tarde, el profesor William Lane Craig estará con nosotros para el espacio de preguntas y respuestas. Entonces, ahora daremos un breve receso de 8 minutos. Procederé a indicar lo mismo en inglés. Bueno, por si hay alguien en este momento, algún invitado extranjero. Okay, so thank you all very much. We'll give a break of about 8 minutes, and we will be back to listen Professor Craig talk. This talk is gonna be, well, was pre-recorded, so it is gonna be projected, and it is gonna be projected for the next 40 minutes, beginning at 3 o'clock here in Costa Rica, that is in 8 minutes. And at 3 and 40 o'clock, Professor Lane Craig is gonna be with us for the Q&A. So please keep that in mind, and we will be back in 7 minutes. Thank you. Mientras regresamos, voy a hacer una prueba de proyección. Entonces voy a poner la grabación unos cuantos minutos y por favor me indican si se escucha bien. Entonces voy a comenzar, bueno, unos minutos, no, perdón, unos cuantos segundos.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
¿Se escuchó?
Sí, perfectamente, Luis.
Perfectamente.
Okay.
Sin problema.
¿Sí? Ok.
Sin problema.
Okay, perfecto, muchas gracias. Thank you very much, Professor Graham Priest, for being back with us.
You're welcome.
We'll begin in 5 minutes. Buenas a todos, buenas Lorenzo, comenzamos en 3 minutos, ya casi.
Perfecto, gracias. Buenas tardes a todos. Good evening, everybody.
Buenas tardes.
Okay, so thank you very much, everyone, for being back with us. I will first explain the rules in Spanish. Okay, bueno, muy buenas tardes a todas y a todos por acompañarnos en este bloque de la tarde del tercer día del primer Congreso Internacional de Lógica, Epistemología y Metodología de la Universidad de Costa Rica. Para este momento está programada la conferencia del profesor William Lane Craig. Esta conferencia ha sido pregrabada, por lo cual el video se proyectará a continuación y a partir de las 3:40 de la tarde el profesor William Lane Craig nos acompañará para el espacio de preguntas y respuestas, así que por favor tengan eso en mente, vayan preparando sus preguntas durante la transmisión del video. Sí les vamos a pedir una serie de cosas. En primer lugar, que por favor mantengan en todo momento apagados sus micrófonos para que no hayan interrupciones. En segundo lugar, y no menos importante, por favor, si desean formularle una pregunta al Dr. Craig, esta deberá formularse en inglés. Todo el espacio de retroalimentación se llevará a cabo en inglés. Y en segundo lugar, la pregunta ha de estar relacionada estrechamente con el tema expuesto por el Dr. Craig en el video. Por favor, si una pregunta se desvía del tema discutido en el video, no será respondida por el Dr. Craig y procederemos con la siguiente pregunta. Aclaro esto de antemano para evitar futuros malentendidos. Entonces, por favor, vayan pensando en sus preguntas. El Dr. Craig está abierto a responderlas, pero estas tienen que estar relacionadas con el tema de la conferencia. Entonces, luego volveré a mencionar esto que voy a decir a continuación, pero las preguntas se pueden formular de la siguiente manera. Me escriben un mensaje privado en el chat que contenga la letra Q y yo les daré la palabra para que formulen su pregunta en orden de llegada de los mensajes. Muchas gracias. Procederé a explicar esto en inglés. Okay, so thank you everyone. We are now about to begin with Professor Craig talk. So it was pre-recorded, so we will now project the video, and when it ends around 3:40 p.m., that is in 40 minutes, Professor Craig is going to be with us for the Q&A. So you can be thinking about possible questions while watching the video. But please, I will ask you a couple of things. Please turn off your microphones during the projection to avoid interruptions. In second place, please, if you want to ask Professor Craig a question, the question has to be strictly related with the contents of presented in the video. If a question is not related with the contents that Dr. Craig discusses in the video, it will not be answered and we will proceed immediately with the next question. Okay, so with no more to say for the moment, I will now begin with the projection. Just one last thing. For the Q&A, we will proceed as in the last sections. If you want to ask Professor Craig a question, please write me down a private message containing the letter Q, and I will give you the word in proceeding in order. So now we will begin with the projection. Thank you.
With majestic simplicity, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. With majestic simplicity, the ancient author of the opening chapter of Genesis thus differentiated his viewpoint not only from the creation myths of Israel's neighbors, but also effectively from modern pantheism, such as found in religions like Advaita Vedanta Hinduism and Taoism, from panentheism, whether of classical Neoplatonist vintage or 20th century Protestant theology, and from polytheism, ranging from ancient paganism to contemporary Mormonism. The biblical writers give us to understand that the universe had a temporal origin and thus imply creatio ex nihilo in the temporal sense, that God brought the universe into being without a material cause at some point in the finite past. Moreover, the Church Fathers, though heavily influenced by Greek thought, dug in their heels concerning the doctrine of creation, sturdily insisting on the temporal creation of the universe ex nihilo, in opposition to the prevailing Hellenistic doctrine of the eternity of matter, a tradition of robust argumentation against the past eternity of the world and in favor of creatio ex nihilo, issuing from the Alexandrian Christian theologian John Philoponus, who died around 580, continued for centuries in Islamic, Jewish, and Christian thought. In 1215, the Catholic Church promulgated temporal creatio ex nihilo as official church doctrine at the Fourth Lateran Council, declaring God to be the creator of all things, visible and invisible, who by his almighty power, from the beginning of time, has created both orders in the same way out of nothing. This remarkable declaration not only affirms that God created everything apart from himself without recourse to any material cause, but even that time itself had a beginning. The doctrine of creation is thus inherently bound up with temporal considerations and entails that God brought the universe into being at some point in the past without any antecedent or contemporaneous material cause. In today's paper, I leave aside the fascinating philosophical arguments raised by the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, which I've sought to explicate elsewhere, in order to focus upon the relevance of contemporary science, in particular astrophysics, and still more specifically, physical cosmogony to creation ex nihilo. Two independently but closely interrelated lines of physical evidence are relevant to the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, namely the evidence from the expansion of the universe and the evidence from the thermodynamic properties of the universe. Due to time limitations, we shall consider only the evidence to the expansion of the universe. In Aristotelian physics, prime matter, of which all physical substances are composed, is, like God himself, eternal and uncreated. It underlies the eternal process of generation and corruption undergone by things in the sublunary realm. In its large-scale structure, the universe has remained unchanged from all eternity. Even with the demise of Aristotelian physics in the scientific revolution completed by Isaac Newton, the assumption of a static universe remained unchallenged. Although Newton himself believed that God had created the world, the universe described by his physics was, to all appearances, eternal. The assumption that the universe was never created was only further reinforced by Hermann Helmholtz's statement in the 19th century of the laws of the conservation of matter and energy. Since matter and energy can be neither created nor destroyed, there must have always been and will always be a universe. That is to say, the universe is temporally infinite in the past and the future. To be sure, there were already clues in pre-relativistic physics, like Olbers's paradox of why the night sky is dark rather than aflame with light if an infinity of stars has existed from eternity past, or like the second law of thermodynamics, which seemed to imply that the universe, if it has existed from eternity, ought to be moribund in a state of equilibrium, that there was something wrong with the prevailing assumption of an eternal static universe. But these niggling worries could not overturn what was everywhere taken for granted, that the universe as a whole has existed and will exist unchanged forever. Tremors of the impending earthquake, which would demolish the old cosmology, were first felt in 1917, when Albert Einstein made a cosmological application of his newly discovered gravitational theory, the general theory of relativity. Einstein assumed that the universe is homogeneous and isotropic, and that it exists in a steady state with a constant mean mass density and a constant curvature of space. To his chagrin, however, he found that general relativity would not permit such a model of the universe unless he introduced into his gravitational field equations a certain fudge factor, lambda, in order to counterbalance the gravitational effect of matter and so ensure a static universe. Einstein's static universe was balanced on a razor's edge, however, and the least perturbation, even the transport of matter from one part of the universe to another, would cause the universe to either implode or to expand. By taking this feature of Einstein's model seriously, the Russian mathematician Alexander Friedmann and the Belgian astronomer Georges Lemaitre were able to formulate independently in the 1920s solutions to the field equations which predicted an expanding universe. The monumental significance of the Friedmann-Lemaitre model lay in its historization of the universe. As one commentator has remarked, up until this time, the idea of the expansion of the universe was absolutely beyond comprehension. Throughout all of human history, the universe was regarded as fixed and immutable, and the idea that it might actually be changing was inconceivable. But if the Friedmann-Lemaitre model were correct, the universe could no longer be adequately treated as a static entity, existing in effect timelessly. Rather, the universe has a history, and time will not be a matter of indifference for our investigation of the universe. In 1929, the American astronomer Edwin Hubble's measurements of the red shift in the optical spectra of light from distant galaxies, which was taken to indicate a universal recession of the light sources in the line of sight, provided a dramatic verification of the Friedmann-Lemaitre model. Incredibly, what Hubble had discovered was the isotropic expansion of the universe predicted by Friedmann and Lemaitre on the basis of Einstein's general theory of relativity. It was a veritable turning point in the history of science. Of all the great predictions that science has ever made over the centuries, exclaims John Wheeler, was there ever one greater than this? To predict, and to predict correctly, and to predict against all expectation a phenomenon so fantastic as the expansion of the universe. According to the Friedmann-Lemaitre model, as time proceeds, the distances separating galactic masses become greater. It is important to understand that as a general relativistic theory, the model does not describe the expansion of the material content of the universe into a pre-existing, empty Newtonian space, but rather the expansion of space itself. The ideal particles of the cosmological fluid constituted by the matter and energy of the universe are conceived to be at rest with respect to space, but to recede progressively from one another as space itself expands or stretches, just as buttons glued to the surface of a balloon would recede from one another as the balloon inflates. As the universe expands, it becomes less and less dense. This has the astonishing implication that as one reverses the expansion and extrapolates back in time, the universe becomes progressively denser until one arrives at a state of infinite density at some point in the finite past. This state represents a singularity at which space-time curvature, along with temperature, pressure, and density, becomes infinite. It therefore constitutes an edge or boundary to space-time itself. Physicist P.C.W. Davies comments, if we extrapolate this prediction to its extreme, we reach a point when all distances in the universe have shrunk to zero. An initial cosmological singularity therefore forms a past temporal extremity to the universe. We cannot continue physical reasoning, or even the concept of space-time, through such an extremity. For this reason, most cosmologists think of the initial singularity as the beginning of the universe. On this view, the Big Bang represents the creation event, the creation not only of all the matter and energy in the universe, but also of space-time itself. The term Big Bang, originally a derisive expression coined by Fred Hoyle to characterize the beginning of the universe, predicted by the Friedmann-Lemaitre model, is thus potentially misleading, since the expansion cannot be visualized from the outside, there being no outside, just as there is no before with respect to the Big Bang. The standard Big Bang model, as the Friedmann-Lemaitre model came to be called, thus describes a universe which is not eternal in the past, but which came into being a finite time ago. Moreover, and this deserves underscoring, the origin it posits is an absolute origin ex nihilo, for not only all matter and energy, but space and time themselves come into being at the initial cosmological singularity. As John Barrow and Frank Tipler emphasize, at this singularity, space and time came into existence. Literally, nothing existed before the singularity. So, if the universe originated at such a singularity, we would truly have a creation ex nihilo. On the standard model, the universe originates ex nihilo in the sense that at the initial singularity, it is true that there is no earlier space-time point, or it is false that something existed prior to the singularity. Although advances in astrophysical cosmogony have forced various revisions in the standard model, principally the addition of an early inflationary era and an accelerating expansion, nothing has called into question its fundamental prediction of the finitude of the past and the beginning of the universe. Indeed, the history of 20th century cosmogony has seen a parade of failed theories trying to avert the absolute beginning predicted by the standard model. These beginningless models have been repeatedly shown either to be physically untenable or to imply the very beginning of the universe, which they sought to avoid. Meanwhile, a series of remarkable singularity theorems has increasingly tightened the loop around empirically tenable cosmogonic models by showing that under more and more generalized conditions, a beginning is inevitable. In 2003, Arvin Bord, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin were able to show that any universe which is on average in a state of cosmic expansion throughout its history cannot be infinite in the past, but must have a beginning. In 2012, Vilenkin showed that cosmogonic models which do not fall under this single condition fail on other grounds to avert the beginning of the universe. Vilenkin concluded there are no models at this time that provide a satisfactory model for a universe without a beginning. More recently, Vilenkin strengthened that conclusion. We have no viable models of an eternal universe. The Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem gives reason to believe that such models simply cannot be constructed. Cosmologist Sean Carroll, in an effort to subvert the implications of the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, has recently cited privately communicated remarks from Alan Guth to the effect that I don't know whether the universe had a beginning. I suspect that the universe didn't have a beginning. It's very likely eternal, but nobody knows. Carroll rightly asks, now how in the world can the author of the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem say the universe is probably eternal? More aptly, how can one of its authors say that it is probably eternal and the other that it is probably not? Carroll assured his audience that the reason is that the theorem is only about classical descriptions of the universe, not about the universe itself. That would not, however, explain how Vilenkin could be so desperately mistaken about the theorem's implications. But now, new light has been shed on Guth's enigmatic remarks through correspondence with the philosopher Daniel Kahn. There, Guth reveals that he favors models of the universe featuring a reversal of time's arrow at some point in the past, and that his remarks to Carroll had reference to such models. Such models do not fall under the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem because they do not satisfy the single condition of that theorem, that the universe is on average in a state of cosmic expansion throughout its history. Thus, neither Guth nor Vilenkin is mistaken about the theorem's implications. Rather, Guth just advocates a model to which the theorem does not apply. Unfortunately, for hopefuls of a past eternal universe like Guth and Carroll, however, such time reversal models are highly unphysical and, even if successful, do not in fact avert the beginning of the universe, but rather imply it. For that time reversed expansion is in no sense in our past, but represents a universe sharing the same beginning point, but expanding in another direction. Vilenkin had already considered such models in his previous discussions and rejected them. That is why he said, and I quote, "All the evidence we have says that the universe had a beginning." The Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem proves that classical space-time, under a single, very general condition, cannot be extended to past infinity, but must reach a boundary at some time in the finite past. Now, either there was something on the other side of that boundary or not. If not, then that boundary just is the beginning of the universe. If there was something on the other side, then it will be a non-classical region described by the yet-to-be-discovered theory of quantum gravity. In that case, Vilenkin says, it will be the beginning of the universe. For consider, if there is such a non-classical region, then it is not past eternal in the classical sense. But neither does it seem to exist literally, timelessly, akin to the way in which philosophers consider abstract objects to be timeless, or theologians take God to be timeless. For this region is supposed to have existed before the classical era, and the classical era is supposed to have emerged from it, which seems to posit a temporal relation between the quantum gravity era and the classical era. In any case, such a quantum state is not stable, and so would either produce the universe from eternity past or not at all. As Anthony Aguirre and John Quijayas argue, it is very difficult to devise a system, especially a quantum one, that does nothing forever, then evolves. A truly stationary or periodic quantum state, which would last forever, would never evolve, whereas one with any instability would not endure for indefinite time. Hence, the quantum gravity era would have to have itself a beginning in order to explain why it transitioned just some 14 billion years ago into classical time and space. Hence, whether at the boundary or at the quantum gravity regime, the universe began to exist. Davies raises the inevitable question: what caused the Big Bang? One might consider some supernatural force, some agency beyond space and time, as being responsible for the Big Bang. Or one might prefer to regard the Big Bang as an event without a cause. It seems to me that we don't have too much choice. Either something outside the physical world or an event without a cause. It might seem metaphysically absurd that the universe should come into being without a cause, and therefore a supernatural agency is to be preferred. But some scientists have contended that quantum physics can explain the origin of the universe from nothing. Unfortunately, some of these scientists have an outrageously naive grasp of language. The word nothing is a term of universal negation. It means not anything. So, for example, if I say, I had nothing for lunch today, I mean I did not have anything for lunch today. If you read an account of World War II, in which it says that nothing stopped the German advance from sweeping across Belgium, it means that the German advance was not stopped by anything. If a theologian tells you that God created the universe out of nothing, he means that God's creation of the universe was not out of anything. The word nothing, to repeat, is simply a term of universal negation, meaning not anything. There's a whole series of similar words of universal negation in English. Nobody means not anybody. None means not one. Nowhere means not anywhere. No place means not in any place. Now, because the word nothing is grammatically a pronoun, we can use it as the subject or direct object of a sentence. By taking these words not as terms of universal negation, but as words referring to something, we can generate all sorts of funny situations. If you say, I saw nobody in the hall, the wiseacre replies, yeah, he's been hanging around there a lot lately. If you say, I had nothing for lunch today, He says, really? How did it taste? These sorts of puns are as old as literature itself. In Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus introduces himself to the Cyclops as no man or nobody. One night, Odysseus puts out the Cyclops' eye. His fellow Cyclopses hear him screaming and yell to him, "What's the matter with you, making so much noise that we can't sleep?" The Cyclops answers, "Nobody is killing me, nobody is killing me." They reply, "Well, if nobody is attacking you, then you must be sick, and there's nothing we can do about it." In Euripides' version of the story, he composes a very funny dialogue. "Why are you crying out, Cyclops? Nobody has undone me." "Then there's no one hurting you after all." "Nobody is blinding me." "Then you're not blind. As blind as you, how could nobody have made you blind? You are mocking me. But where is this nobody?" "Nowhere, Cyclops." The use of words of negation like nothing, nobody, and no one as singular terms referring to something is a joke. How astonishing, then, to find that some physicists whose mother tongue is English have used these words precisely as singular terms of reference. For example, Lawrence Krauss has told us with a straight face, there are a variety of forms of nothing, and they all have physical definitions. The laws of quantum mechanics tell us that nothing is unstable. 70% of the dominant stuff in the universe is nothing. There's nothing there, but it has energy. Nothing weighs something. Nothing is almost everything. All of these claims take the word nothing to be a singular term referring to something. For example, the quantum vacuum or quantum mechanical fields. These are physical realities and therefore clearly something. To call these realities nothing is at best misleading, guaranteed to confuse lay people, and at worst, a deliberate misrepresentation of science. Such statements do not even begin to address, much less answer, the question why the universe exists rather than nothing. In his review of Krauss's book, A Universe from Nothing, David Albert, an eminent philosopher of quantum physics, explains, with respect to Krauss's first kind of nothing, vacuum states are particular arrangements of elementary physical stuff. The fact that some arrangements of fields happen to correspond to the existence of particles and some don't is not a whit more mysterious than the fact that some of the possible arrangements of my fingers happen to correspond to the existence of a fist, and some don't. And the fact that particles can pop in and out of existence over time as those fields rearrange themselves is not a whit more mysterious than the fact that fists can pop in and out of existence over time as my fingers rearrange themselves. And none of these poppings amounts to anything even remotely in the neighborhood of a creation from nothing. He concludes Krauss is dead wrong, and his religious and philosophical critics are absolutely right. Alex Vilenkin has a different proposal as to how the universe could come into being from literally nothing. In response to the claim of a supernatural agency, he says, regarding the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem and its relation to God, I think the theorem implies the existence of a rather special state at the past boundary of classical space-time, some mechanism is required to impose that state. Craig wants this mechanism to be God, but I think quantum cosmology could do just as well. Just what does Vilenkin have in mind here? Well, he explains modern physics can describe the emergence of the universe as a physical process that does not require a cause. Nothing can be created from nothing, says Lucretius, if only because the conservation of energy makes it impossible to create nothing from nothing. And I think that's a misprint. I think he meant to say that the conservation laws make it impossible to create something from nothing. Vilenkin goes on to say there is a loophole in this reasoning. The energy of the gravitational field is negative. It is conceivable that this negative energy could compensate for the positive energy of matter, making the total energy of the cosmos equal to zero. In fact, this is precisely what happens in a closed universe, in which space closes on itself like the surface of a sphere. It follows from the laws of general relativity that the total energy of such a universe is necessarily equal to zero. If all the conserved numbers of a closed universe are equal to zero, then there is nothing to prevent such a universe from being spontaneously created out of nothing. And according to quantum mechanics, any process which is not strictly forbidden by the conservation laws will happen with some probability. What causes the universe to pop out of nothing? No cause is needed. I think this is a terrible argument. Grant the supposition that the positive energy associated with matter is exactly counterbalanced by the negative energy associated with gravity, so that on balance, the total energy is zero. Vilenkin's key move comes with the claim that in such a case, there is nothing to prevent such a universe from being spontaneously created out of nothing. Now, this claim is a triviality. Necessarily, if there is nothing, then there is nothing to prevent the universe from coming into being. By the same token, if there is nothing, then there is nothing to permit the universe to come into being. If there were anything to prevent or permit the universe's coming into being, then there would be something, not nothing. If there is nothing, then there is nothing, period. The absence of anything to prevent the universe's coming into being does not, however, imply the metaphysical possibility of the universe's coming into being from nothing. To illustrate, if there were nothing, then there would be nothing to prevent God's coming into being from nothing. But that does not entail that such a thing is metaphysically possible. It is metaphysically impossible for God to come into being, even if there were nothing to prevent it because nothing existed. Vilenkin, however, infers that no cause is needed for the universe's coming into being because the conservation laws would not prevent it. And, according to quantum mechanics, any process which is not strictly forbidden by the conservation laws will happen. The argument assumes that if there were nothing, then both the conservation laws and quantum physical laws would still hold. This is far from obvious, however, since in the absence of anything at all, it's not clear that the laws governing our universe would hold. In any case, why think that given the laws of quantum mechanics, anything not strictly forbidden by the conservation laws will happen? The conservation laws do not strictly forbid God's sending everyone to heaven, but that hardly gives grounds for optimism. neither do they strictly forbid his sending everyone to hell, in which case both outcomes will occur, which is logically impossible as they are logically contrary universal generalizations. The point can be made non-theologically as well. The conservation laws do not strictly forbid something's coming into existence, but neither do they strictly forbid nothing's coming into existence. But both cannot happen. It is logically absurd to think that because something is not forbidden by the conservation laws, it will therefore happen. Finally, Vilenkin's inference that because the positive and negative energy in the universe sum to zero, therefore no cause of the universe's coming into being is needed, is hard to take seriously. This is like saying that if your debts balance your assets, then your net worth is zero, and so there is no cause of your financial situation. Vilenkin would not, I hope, agree with Peter Atkins that because the positive and negative energy of the universe sum to zero, therefore nothing exists now, and so nothing did indeed come from nothing. For as Descartes taught us, I, at least, obviously exist, and so something exists. Christopher Isham, Britain's premier quantum cosmologist, rightly points out that there still needs to be ontic seeding to create the positive and negative energy in the first place, even if on balance its sum is naught. Even if one were to concede the absence of a material cause of the universe, the need of an efficient cause is patent. We thus have two independent lines of scientific evidence in support of the beginning of the universe. First, as we have seen today, the expansion of the universe implies that the universe had a beginning. Second, thermodynamics also shows that the universe began to exist. Because these lines of evidence are independent and mutually reinforcing, the confirmation they supply for a beginning of the universe is all the stronger. Of course, as with all scientific results, this evidence is provisional. As Sean Carroll reminds us, science isn't in the business of proving things. Rather, science judges the merits of competing models in terms of their simplicity, clarity, comprehensiveness, and fit to the data. Unsuccessful theories are never disproven, as we can always concoct elaborate schemes to save the phenomena. They just fade away as better theories gain acceptance. Science cannot force us to accept the beginning of the universe. One can always concoct elaborate schemes to explain away the evidence. But those schemes have not fared well in displaying the aforementioned scientific virtues. Given the metaphysical impossibility of the universe's coming into being from nothing, belief in a supernatural creator is eminently reasonable. At the very least, we can say confidently that the person who believes in the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo will not find himself contradicted by the empirical evidence of contemporary cosmology, but, on the contrary, fully in line with it.
Okay, just a second. Thank you very much, Professor Greg, for being here with us. On behalf of the entire organizing committee of this first International Congress on Logic, Methodology, and Epistemology of the University of Costa Rica, it is a great honor that you can be here with us today. So before beginning with the Q&A, I just want to, now that you are with us, I just want to briefly introduce you to the public. So Professor William Lane Craig is an American analytic philosopher, Christian theologian, and Christian apologist. He is professor of philosophy at Houston Baptist University and research professor of philosophy at Biola University's Talbot School of Theology. He has authored or edited over 30 books and over 200 articles published in specialized journals in philosophy and theology, and is especially known for his reformulation and defense of the Calem cosmological argument for the existence of God. Additionally, he is well known worldwide for his work in favor of the historical plausibility of the resurrection of Jesus and for his studies of divine aseity. So the title of the talk we just heard is Contemporary Expansion Models and Creatio Ex Nihilo. So thank you very much. And now we may proceed with the Q&A. As I mentioned at the beginning, if someone wants to ask a question to Professor Craig, please write me down a private message in the chat and we will proceed in order. So now we have our first question. I will give the word to Felipe Vargas, so you may proceed. Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much for your conversation and your arguments, Lane Craig. My first question is,
Felipe, could I ask you to speak a louder, please? Maybe closer to the microphone. Yeah. It's difficult.
I will be. Do you hear me better?
Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. I will start again. Thanks again for your excellent conversation. Now, I was about to ask you, if we admit the posture that if the universe has a beginning, it must have a cause, right? You told us. It is not possible to talk about cause without the space-time because we understand the laws of cause just in the space of time, inside the space-time. We cannot take that particular meaning. No particular meaning. We cannot take that particular terminology to apply to something that has no space and time, because we're out of space and time, and out of space and time cannot be a cause, not at least as we understand it in physics. Maybe it could be a metaphysical cause, like Augustine and the footprint, for example. It doesn't has to be with time, because time here is, as we are understanding it, not like infinity time, but out of the time. So we can have a metaphysical cause. So that cause will be metaphysical. So since we admit the creatio ex nihilo, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit nervous. We have a metaphysical conclusion that the universe is not absolute, right? So it must rely his existence in an absolute, because when we intuitional think in something expanding, we already make the relational belief that it must be moving to a new place. No space-time means nothing. There could be an indetermination yet to discover by the quantum physics, no intelligent and without will or teleology. What metaphysical argument will be better to sustain the existence of an intelligent God that contains this not absolute universe in his absolute existence? And how this entity by itself, it will be necessary metaphysically.
Okay. You've said a number of things that I think are very profound that I want to emphasize. One is that I think that you have correctly identified the extent to which contemporary philosophy is dominated by W.V.O. Quine's philosophical naturalism. His naturalized epistemology denies what he calls first philosophy, which would be the kind of metaphysics I'm engaging in. For Quine, metaphysics is legitimate, but only as an extension of our physical sciences. And therefore, as you say, notions like time and causality will be given a purely scientific content. And I simply reject that kind of naturalized epistemology. I'm interested in doing metaphysics in the grand tradition of Western philosophy. And when I think in those terms, I see absolutely no reason to think that the idea of a trans-temporal, trans-spatial cause is impossible metaphysically. It seems to me that it's perfectly defensible. So we should not assume that in the absence of space and time, there's nothing. That is to beg the question in favor of naturalism. And in terms of what sort of argument one might give for a kind of metaphysical grounding of the physical universe, I am very sympathetic, for example, to an argument such as Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz offered based on the contingency of the universe. For a metaphysically necessary being which transcends the universe and provides the sufficient reason for why anything at all exists. But moreover, I think that the argument that I defended today also gives grounds for such a conclusion. The argument that I defended today comes out of a quite different tradition in Western philosophy that was a response to Aristotle's doctrine of the eternity of the world and sought to demonstrate creatio ex nihilo. This argument was developed by early Christian commentators in Alexandria. And after Islam swept over North Africa, this tradition was absorbed into medieval Islamic theology and became the centerpiece of a movement called Kalam, which is medieval Islamic scholasticism. This argument then was bequeathed back again to the Latin-speaking West through the intermediary of Jewish philosophers and theologians who wrote in Arabic and also in Latin. And there it became the subject of great debate, eventually becoming enshrined in the thesis of Kant's first antinomy concerning time in his Critique of Pure Reason. And I think that this is a good argument. It basically says that if anything begins to exist, it has to have a cause. Something can't come into being from nothing. But then secondly, we have good evidence, both philosophically and scientifically, that the universe began to exist. And today I've talked a little bit about some of the scientific evidence in support of that premise, but I also think that some of the arguments offered by these medieval philosophers and theologians were sound arguments as well, so that we have both philosophical arguments and scientific confirmation of the premise the universe began to exist. And from that, it follows that therefore the universe has a cause of its existence. And as the cause of matter and energy, time and space, this cause will have to be a timeless, spaceless, uncaused, beginningless, enormously powerful, and I would also argue personal creator of the universe. And that's a quite different subject that I haven't talked about today. But this argument, if sound, I think gives us just precisely the kind of grounding for a metaphysical cause that you enunciated.
Yeah, just last doubt, because there could be an indetermination that it must be to be discovered yet by the quantum physics, that could be out of space and time, matter and energy, that probably could cause the universe, and it could be possible if we think from speculative reason. We can think this as an absolute as well as God. What is the difference between this as being an entity by itself necessary and God as being entity by itself necessary?
Well, I tried to address that question today by looking at a couple of attempts to exploit quantum physics to explain the origin of the universe from nothing, namely Lawrence Krauss's and then Alex Vilenkin's. And in either case, I don't think that those models or efforts explain how something can come into being from nothing, or how the universe could come into being from nothing without a cause. So I would just invite you to look at that critique again. And then I would underline what Sean Carroll said at the end of my talk. Science can never prove something decisively. One can always say, well, maybe in the future, there will be a model developed that will restore the past eternity of the universe, or explain how the universe could come into being from nothing. And that's fine. As Carroll said, we assess models by things like their explanatory power, their explanatory scope, their plausibility, their clarity, and so forth. And so these models are never decisively discredited. They just fail with respect to some of these theoretical virtues, and therefore they are neglected and ignored. And I allow the possibility that some scientific model might come along in the future, but so far it hasn't. And therefore, I think we're justified in drawing the inference on the basis of our best evidence today.
Thank you so much for your answers, Dr. Lane Craig. I have read you since I was a child, and some of the questions that I have for many years,
yes,
you are answering me those questions. So I'm very, very thankful with you.
Oh, thank you. You know, I resonate with what you said, because I remember as a boy lying in bed at night thinking about these questions about the beginning of the universe and the infinity of the past. And these are deeply gripping and provocative questions. And so I'm glad you're wrestling with them as well.
Yes, and I'm an atheist as well.
Okay, thank you very much to both of you. Now we will proceed with our next question by Jorge Acuña. He wrote it down, so I will project. I will read it, but I think you can see it now. So the question by Jorge is, I have the hypothesis that the universe was originated from a black hole, and the cause that allowed that change from the event of a black hole to the event of an expanding universe was the gravitational field of a web of physical systems that contain the black hole. The gravitational field of this web exceeds the gravitational field of the black hole, and this web is contracted by gravity, which produces a gravitational field in constant increase that expands the matter of the universe from a black hole. In this case, dark energy is the gravitational field of a web of physical systems over the universe. I have called this hypothesis the multiverse of gravitational web, and it is incompatible with your Kalam cosmological argument. If my hypothesis of the origin of the universe is true, what theological consequences does it have?
Okay, well, I don't think that this model does have a realistic chance of describing our universe. I suspect that it's in deep contradiction with the thermodynamic properties of the universe. But that wasn't the question. The question was, if the hypothesis is true, what theological consequences would it have? Well, I don't think it would have any theological consequences, because the theist would maintain that God is the creator of that original web or gravitational field of physical systems that contain the black hole. So I don't see that this would have theological consequences at all. It wouldn't contradict the doctrine of creation.
Okay, so I think Jorge is having trouble with his microphone. So if he wants to answer something to what Prof. Craig said, we will go back in a couple of minutes with this response. So we may now proceed to another question. But now it is the time for Professor Lorenzo Bocafoli. So you may ask your question, please.
Thank you very much, Luis. And thank you very much, Professor Craig, for being here with us. I was thinking about, of course, the famous interchange and dialogue between the Pope, John Paul II, and Stephen Hawking about the origin and the creatio ex nihilo.
Yes.
Was quite famous, no? At the Pontifical Academy of Sciences and so on. And there are different relations about what happened. Because Hawking said, the Pope told me we shouldn't search before the beginning, so or something in this direction. So there is something as not just an impossibility of science of reaching what Atlas something, but something like this is a command. So. Something moral. So Hawking gave this kind of so to say, nuance
yes.
Of the talk of the Pope. But maybe the Pope told him simply that it's not possible for science to make this step before the beginning. So I'm thinking, if science uses models to understand how our universe works, does not the theologian do something similar? I make a model about what I know about what should be or could be. So there is a beginning. What is that? What can I see before the beginning? What can be there before the beginning? So I make this kind of association and I make a model. We are in the position of science if we analyze the things from this point of view. And in this sense, there is no reason not to searching for something before this, because it's anyway a model and we can change the model, we can make steps in that direction.
Yeah. As I've read Stephen Hawking's works, I think that Hawking had a real anti-clerical edge to him. There was almost a kind of emotional bitterness there toward ecclesiastical authorities. And I think that emerged in the way he misrepresented the Pope's remarks. Moreover, I think that what Hawking himself said was quite mistaken philosophically. Hawking, though a brilliant physicist, was not a good philosopher. And his argument against the existence of a creator was that if there isn't any beginning point of the universe, then there isn't a creator of the universe. And that's not a good argument, because having a beginning doesn't require having a beginning point. The past is finite if and only if for any finite interval of time that you pick, say seconds or minutes or years, there are only a finite number of equal intervals prior to the present interval. And that doesn't require that that series begins with a point. So Hawking was quite unjustified in thinking that having a beginning entails having a beginning point. Now, I like what you said about modeling. I do think that philosophers, theologians are involved in the task of modeling. But I just would want to be very careful to say, as I did to the previous questioner, that we're doing metaphysics here and not physics. I wouldn't want anyone to think that I am offering a theistic physical model in competition with quantum cosmology or Big Bang theory. Vilenkin's model may well be right. That isn't my field to criticize him. I'm interested in the philosophical implications and assumptions that he makes. And so while I think we are constructing, say, a theological model of a personal agent who exists timelessly and spacelessly and brings the universe into existence, we just need to be careful that we're not misunderstood as offering something that is in competition with our best scientific models of the origin of the universe.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm quite satisfied. I just wanted to add a little thing. The speaks, the talk between Hawking and the Pope and John Paul II was actually about a beginning. But in the paper of Hawking, in the first paper of Hawking, he doesn't talk about the beginning. He talks actually about the boundary. He says, there is not the point of something before, because it's something like searching a point northern than the North Pole.
Right.
So
right. The idea
is more a boundary than a point in a line, or yeah.
Yeah. See, the idea there is that if you model space-time in the standard Big Bang model, it's like a cone that goes back to a point. And that point is a boundary of the cone. The cone cannot be extended through that point. So it constitutes a boundary. But in Hawking's model, space-time is rounded off near the beginning, rather like a badminton birdie or shuttlecock. And therefore, as you say, just as there is no boundary point at the North Pole, so in his universe, there is no boundary point. And he inferred from that therefore there's no need for a creator. And as I say, that makes the mistake of thinking that having a beginning entails having a beginning point, which is false.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Certainly.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we have a question by Nicolas Molina. So I will give you the word now. Nicolas, do you hear us? Well, he wrote down the question, so I will read it. Oh, wait a second, please. Yes, I will read it. So his question is, why the first cause of the universe must be understood with a intentioned cause, which would be the considerations of a creator God that makes the universe without intentions. So yes, why the first cause must have intentions.
Intentions. Okay. Yes. This relates to what I mentioned earlier about thinking that this is not just a mechanically operating, impersonal set of necessary and sufficient conditions, but rather this is a personal agent, a personal creator. And in my published work, I offer three independent arguments for that conclusion. The first one is that this first uncaused cause exists timelessly and spacelessly and immaterially as the creator of time, space, and matter. Now, there are only two philosophical candidates that I know of that could fill that description. One would be an abstract object, like a number. They exist timelessly, spacelessly, and are immaterial. Or else an unembodied mind or consciousness. But here's the rub: an abstract object can't cause anything. By definition, an abstract object is causally effete. And from that, it follows that the cause of the universe must be a personal, unembodied mind or agent. The second argument is one that was given by the medieval Muslim philosophers I spoke about earlier. Al-Ghazali argued that in order to explain the origin of a temporal effect from a beginning, you must have a personal agent endowed with freedom of the will who can bring the universe into being without any antecedent determining conditions. He points out that if the cause of the universe has existed permanently and changelessly, then if the necessary and sufficient conditions for the existence of the universe are given, then the existence of the universe must be given. So the universe would be co-eternal. It would exist from eternity past. In order to explain how a temporal effect with the beginning could arise from a permanent, timeless, changeless cause, he argued it has to be a personal agent who is endowed with freedom of the will, who can therefore arbitrarily choose to create the universe without any antecedent determining conditions. And I think this is a very powerful argument for the personhood of the first cause. And then the third argument is the one given by the British philosopher Richard Swinburne, who points out that causal explanations are one of two types: either a scientific explanation in terms of natural laws and initial conditions, or else a volitional, personal explanation given in terms of the volitions of a personal agent. So, for example, if I walk into the kitchen and I see that the kettle is boiling on the stove, and I say to Jan, "Why is the kettle boiling?" She could either say, "Well, because the kinetic energy of the fire is being transferred to the molecules of the water, causing them to vibrate more violently so that some is thrown off in the form of steam." Or she could say, "I put it on to make a cup of tea. Would you like some?" Both of those are perfectly legitimate types of causal explanation, one scientific, one personal. Now, Swinburne points out that a first physical state of the universe cannot have a scientific explanation precisely because it is first. And therefore, if there is to be a causal explanation of a first physical state of the universe, it can only be given in terms of a personal explanation. So for those three reasons, I think we have persuasive grounds for thinking that the cause of the origin of the universe is a personal agent.
Okay, thank you very much. We will proceed. Now I will project, wait a second. I have an answer by Jorge Acuña to the previous question. He said that the idea of a universe in a gravitational web is not incompatible with an infinite cosmos. And in this hypothesis, God can operate immanently in the cosmos and be ontologically transcendent to the cosmos like Spinoza's God. In this hypothesis, the cause of the increase in the entropy of the universe is the gravitational field of the web that expands the universe.
Yeah. Spinoza's God does not transcend the universe. He is the universe. It would be the God of Gottfried Leibniz that would transcend the universe. And as I said earlier, I agree with Leibniz that even given the past eternity of the universe, you can still run a cosmological argument from contingency for a metaphysically necessary being, which is the sufficient reason for the existence of the cosmos. So I am quite sympathetic with that. I don't think the model is at all plausible, but even if it were true, as I say, I do not think that it has theological consequences because, as the questioner points out, a theist could believe in an infinite past and yet in a transcendent, metaphysically necessary deity along Leibnizian lines. I might add this was also the perspective of Thomas Aquinas. as well. In Aquinas's arguments, he always presupposed the past eternity of the universe, even though he didn't believe in it on grounds of biblical revelation. He always argued on the assumption that the universe is past eternal, and nevertheless presented multiple arguments for God's existence.
Thank you very much. Now we have a question by Professor Juan Diego Moya. Okay, no. Sorry, I understood incorrectly. Okay, so we will proceed with the next. Let me see. Next question is by Mario Solis, so you may proceed.
Yeah, thank you very much. Here's a question. You're defending the idea of a creator, and that is, as you said, personal agency. That's what that's your presupposition, let's say, or your claim, better. And I have a question about that. The question is more or less the following: if there is if we talk about and accept, say, this claim about personal agency, we should accept something about normativity coming out from that personal agency.
Say something about what coming out?
Normativity.
I'm not understanding you. What is the word again?
Norms, normativity.
Normativity?
Yeah.
Okay, what do you mean?
I mean that if in order for us to talk about agency and personal agency, we are engaged in the talk about norms and normativity, right?
How so? I'm not following. How is talking about personal agency talking about normativity? I don't follow.
Because a free agent, I suppose it is free, right? If it is a personal agent.
Yes, yeah, free agent.
In order for this entity to be free, right?
Yes.
There must be the idea of action, right? Creation, for instance, is an action, right?
Yes.
And if that is the case, there might be, and that's my question, right? There might be a normative structure, right? For this entity to act. That is to say, creating this world is good, for instance.
Now, the only sense of normativity that I could think of there that would be relevant would be moral normativity. That if this creator is good, then there would be moral norms governing creation. On the other hand, the argument doesn't say really anything about the moral nature of this cause of the universe. For all we know, he could be an absolute stinker. He might not conform to moral norms. That seems to me to be an additional question for ethicists to raise. But apart from moral normativity, I don't see what normativity is involved in saying this agent has acted to create the universe.
I'm not presupposing that is that's previous to the person or entity that has agency or acts. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that there's a previous law. This is a free agent. I'm just saying that the logic of it, conceptually, we're talking of, these are concepts, agency and personhood. And in those concepts, you find the idea of action and the idea of, I'm not talking about intentions. I'm talking about reasons for action.
Yes.
Right. So I haven't arrived to my question, to be honest. I'm going there.
Okay.
I'm trying to get there, and I'm apologies.
Sorry, I'm just trying to understand.
That takes a lot of time. Apologies, and Luis, you can tell me if that's the case. But I'm trying to arrive at the following. I mean, there are other kinds of norms. Say human rights are norms. Let's imagine that. And I think you and I, we agree that, for instance, a norm that is moral, political, if you wish, about slavery,
yes,
or torture, kids, for instance, that torture or slavery.
Yes.
So we agree that we must follow, these sort of norms, right?
Yes.
And that's great. My question is there something similar to your claims about God, creation, and agency that leads us to support some sort of norms that guides us? You see, that's my point.
Yes.
I mean, if you draw that line.
Yes, I have done that. In fact, I just finished teaching a class at Houston Baptist University with Professor David Baggett on the moral argument for the existence of God. And in that class, I argued that God is a necessary precondition for the objectivity of moral values and duties, and that in our moral experience, as you point out, we apprehend a realm of moral values and duties that impose themselves upon us, norms in effect, and that naturalism cannot provide a good explanation for the objectivity of moral values and duties, and that therefore this gives moral grounds for believing in the existence of God. And if this argument is cogent, it is a very nice complement to the cosmological argument that I've talked about today, because the cosmological argument tells us nothing about the moral character of the creator of the universe. But when supplemented with the moral argument, I think a simpler view of the world, a simpler metaphysic, would be to say that the creator of the universe is also the moral lawgiver, that God is the source of both natural physical laws and moral laws, and that therefore they coalesce in him as the metaphysical ultimate. So I'm very sympathetic to the type of approach that you seem to be suggesting in your question.
Yeah, although it has a lot of problems, natural fallacies and a lot of problems. Yeah.
I take a look at some of the things that I've done on this. For example, I did a debate that was published by Rutledge with Eric Wielenberg, who is a naturalist, on what is the best explanation of moral values and duties. I had another book published with the humanist philosopher Paul Kurtz, which was entitled, Is Goodness Without God Good Enough? And so in my published work, I've defended this sort of argument in numerous places, and I would invite you to consider it and see whether or not it addresses any of those difficulties you mentioned.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we will proceed with the next. Just give me a second, please. We have a question by Marisela Rojas. Marisela, do you prefer that I read it, or do you want to ask it yourself? You're muted. Marisela, you're muted.
Okay. Thank you. I would like to say thank you to Mr. Lane Craig. It's an honor really to have him here in Costa Rica. We have an apologetics group that follow him, and we admire his job. I would like to ask him, how do we know that our biblical God is the only one, is the one that fulfills the requirements to be the universal creator? How do we know? Which should be his characteristics to know that he is the only God.
Okay. So the question
that
is
can
about
be
how to...
of universe, but because he has some characteristics very special for to be the creator of this universe.
So the question was about the biblical God. Was that the word?
Yes.
The biblical God. Okay.
Yes.
None of the arguments that I have talked about today aim to prove the existence of the biblical God, or particularly the Christian God. They are consistent with a sort of generic monotheism that would be affirmed by Christians, Jews, Muslims, deists, and others. In order to move from a kind of generic theism to Christian theism, I think that one must look at the person of Jesus of Nazareth and ask, who was this man? What is the best explanation of this man, his teaching, his ministry, and especially of his alleged resurrection from the dead? I did my doctoral work in theology at the University of Munich under Wolfhard Pallenbach on this question of Jesus' resurrection. And to my surprise, quite honestly, I found that the principal historical facts undergirding the inference to Jesus' historical resurrection are acknowledged today by the wide majority of New Testament critics, whether Christian, Jewish, or non-Christian. And I would argue that the best explanation of these facts is the one that the original disciples gave, namely that God raised Jesus from the dead. Now, if it's true that God raised Jesus from the dead, then that means that God has publicly and unequivocally confirmed the allegedly blasphemous claims that Jesus made, for which he was ultimately crucified. So that God has vindicated him, he has confirmed him, and it would be on that basis that I would say that I think Christian theism is true, rather than say Islamic theism or merely Jewish theism. So it all depends on what you think of the historical Jesus.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
So we will proceed with our next question. Okay. Wait a second. We have another question by Professor Lorenzo.
Thank you very much, Luis. I'm sorry, Professor Craig, that I bore you again, but I'm quite interested in the argument as an agnostic as I am, because I'm not religious, but I'm quite interested in this kind of question, probably because of this. So I remember about a physicist presenting various papers to the Pontifical Academy of Science. I know you're not a Catholic Christian, but this is an institution that's quite famous for the dialogue between religious people and scientists, you know, after the Council Vatican II about the compatibility and so on. Okay, I'm talking about Roland Omné. Roland Omné is French. He has worked with Gelman about the first models of so quarks and the quantum field theories and so on. And he sustains he has proposed the model of the coherentism and things like this. He has published a couple of books about philosophy of quantum mechanics and philosophy of physics that are quite interesting because he doesn't suppose the primacy of abstract structure or mathematical structure on physical systems. It's quite the other way around. So he gives the name to his philosophical position. He gives the name physicalism. He means that the abstract structure are together with the physical.
Could you repeat that? What does he mean by physicalism? Could you repeat that, please?
Physism. he doesn't say physicalism, because physicalism would be a kind maybe of reductionism.
Yes.
He gives the name physism. It's different than physicalism. I've expressed myself wrong. Physism.
Yes.
And he means that together with the physical systems, we are given the abstract system. So they can't be completely separated, but they can't be so equalized also. So there are the two directions. It's together, but it's not the same thing.
Yes.
And he thinks this kind of argument telling us that the rules, the regularity is already in the universe. And because of it, we have models of regularity. Because of it, we use logic and we use mathematics, because it's in the universe. So there are rules. And there should be a theological argument too. When he presented his paper to the Pontifical Academy, he told, okay, that's my opinion. And then from here, the argument should be something theological, not just philosophical theological.
Now, could you tell me again, I didn't catch the gentleman's name. What is his name?
Roland Omne. I can write it down here in the chat.
I'm not familiar with him. Go ahead.
Roland Omne, friend of John. Okay, on the basis of this presupposition, it's a kind of philosophy of quantum mechanics of Roland Omne.
Yes.
Have you personally the project, or are you used to work together with scientists open to the idea of a possible theological vision? Because they are not so. They are not the mainstream, so to say, under the cosmology, but there are, of course, religious physicists, astrophysicists, and so on. So it's not prohibited, and they exist. I remember Technique, Italian, that is quite in Italy, it was quite famous. So, do you do this? Would you like to do this? And what do you think about this kind of arguments proposed by some physicists?
I really like this argument. I did a paper just this past year on Eugene Wigner. Wigner was a Hungarian-born mathematical physicist who won the Nobel Prize for his work in quantum physics. And Wigner wrote a paper called On the Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics. And in this paper, Wigner, I think, presents a stunning argument for how perplexing it is, how strange it is that physical phenomena should be describable by us through elegant mathematical laws. And Wigner had no explanation for this. He says, I think some 16 times in his paper, that this is a miracle. He says this is a miracle which we neither understand nor deserve. And so what I am arguing in this paper that I've written now is that Wigner was more right than he knew, that the best explanation is that it is literally a miracle. Namely, the best explanation for the applicability of mathematics to the physical phenomena is that the physical world is the product of a designing intelligence who has built the universe on these mathematical laws. And that's why mathematics applies to the physical world. And when you look at the inability of naturalism to explain the applicability of mathematics, I think this emerges as an argument of just enormous persuasive power. It's hard to think of any alternative explanation of the applicability of mathematics to the physical phenomena, apart from a theistic sort of hypothesis. So this paper that I've written is going to be published in a book by Colin Roelof, R-U-L-O-F-F, Roelof. And it's something like New Arguments in Natural Theology or something of that sort. But if you click on Amazon for Colin Roelof, I'm sure you'll find his new book, and my essay is in that. So I'm going to be very interested to see what others have to say. And in writing this article, I corresponded with a number of physicists, bouncing ideas off of them, asking them questions about Wigner's examples, and so forth. And so the collaboration with professional mathematical physicists was very profitable to me, and I hope it will continue.
Wow. Okay. Just I wanted to know this. Very interesting, this point of view, and yeah. Normally, I can imagine that you find a good relation, a good collaboration with physicists and mathematicians that are Platonists fundamentally. So they believe in the existence of abstract structures. They exist, they are there, and so quite realist in the sense of the ontology of abstract objects. So mathematical Platonists. Is a kind of philosophy of mathematics that may be in good relation with a theological position.
With your philosophy of mathematics as well. That's very true.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Now the next question is going to be by Felipe Vargas. So you may proceed, please.
Thank you so much. Well, there was another question that arose me with Mario's intervention, but I will skip that for the moment, and I will just ask you. For the second argument that you give for intentionality, you said that it is not possible that a metaphysical cause, or I mean that a metaphysical entity can be the cause of something if it is not personhood.
Well, not exactly. Let me make clear what I was saying, or what Al-Ghazali was saying. Certainly, you could have a metaphysical cause of a temporal object, for example, an eternal universe, such as we spoke of earlier today. But what Al-Ghazali was wondering about was, how can you have a cause which is permanent and changeless, and yet an effect of that cause that just began to exist a finite time ago? It seems that the cause should either exist from eternity or pardon me, it seems that the effect should exist either from eternity or not at all. But how can you get a temporal effect with a beginning from a changeless permanent cause? And I think his answer to that is almost inescapable. It has to be a cause endowed with freedom of the will.
Now I understand it better. Thank you so much. Now, regarding to the normativity that was talking Mario Solis, and he says there are lots of problems with the theology in that sense, because he is talking in a moral sense when he talks about normativity. If we accept that this personhood, this God person is good, and then how we can explain evil?
Yeah, right.
That's the lots of problems. Also, not only the moral evil, but the natural evil.
Yes.
For example, there's I don't know, some animal, and there is raining, and it comes. For example, I don't know, some disaster, and it causes a lot of suffering, and it's a natural. It's a natural cause. But even though there is an atheist argument that is most likely like there is one sexual abuser in the middle of the forest with a victim that cannot defend herself from that abuser, presuming that there exists a super entity that knows all, that has all power, and that he has the power to stop that abuser, why does he not avoid that, and he permits that? The only answer that I can find for that question, it's in Augustine when he says, if we accept that God is the absolute good, we could not conceive that he allowed evil, but only for a greater good. I don't know if you agree with me with that assumption.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the work of the American philosopher Alvin Plantinga on the problem of evil? You're shaking your head, yes.
Yes, of course.
I think that Plantinga has really made important contributions to this subject. And as a result of his work, I think it's generally agreed that there's no logical contradiction between God and the evil and suffering in the world. And therefore, what the atheist has to show is that it is improbable that God could have morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil and suffering in the world. And here I would argue that this requires us to make probability judgments, which we are simply not in a position to make with any sort of confidence. God's morally sufficient reasons for permitting some incident of suffering that enters our lives might not emerge until centuries from now, maybe in another country. In fact, from a Christian point of view, God's overriding purpose for creating humanity is to draw as many people as possible into a saving love relationship with himself, so that they will find eternal life and salvation. And it's not at all implausible, I think, that only in a world that is suffused with natural and moral evil would the optimal number of people freely come to know God and find salvation. So what the atheist would have to show is that there is another world feasible for God, which has less suffering and evil, but which has just as much salvation and eternal life as the actual world. And I think you'd agree that that is a probability judgment that is just completely beyond us. And that therefore, the problem of evil puts a burden of proof upon the atheist's shoulders that is so heavy that no one has been able to bear it. Let me just say one other thing. And that is, I think there's actually a good argument for the existence of God from moral evil. And it would go like this: if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. 2, evil exists. 3, therefore, objective moral values and duties exist. Some things are evil. 4, therefore, God exists. So paradoxically, while evil at a surface level seems to call into question God's existence, at a deeper level, I think that evil actually proves God's existence, because on naturalism, while there might be suffering in the world, there really wouldn't be moral evil. And so the existence of moral evil, it seems to me, requires the existence of God.
Okay, thank you very much. We will proceed with another question. Please remember that the topics of the question need to be more related to the contents of the video. Next in line is Professor Graham Priest, so you may now proceed.
Thank you, and thanks for the talk. That was really interesting. I had 2 related questions, comments. I'm not quite sure how to describe them, but look, I'm not a physicist. I'm not competent to discuss the physics. So let's agree with your point that about the time in the cosmos. Okay. Now, suppose that's right. Then, if there is an explanation for the cosmos, and it's coming to be whatever that means, then it can't be of a kind that presupposes time. That seems right. So the first question is this. Why should one suppose that there is an explanation? Now, at some point in your talk, I think you described this as metaphysically absurd. That sounds to me like an appeal to the principle of sufficient reason. And, so the question is, why should one presuppose the principle of sufficient reason?
Yes.
It's not obvious to me. Okay, that's the first question. You may have an interesting answer to that. Second question is this. Let's agree that there is an explanation. Okay. Now, you categorize explanations into two. One was temporal causal and one was agential. And you said those are the only two kinds. I don't actually think that's true. An agential explanation is certainly one possibility. Actually, I'm not sure about that, because I'm not sure that the notion of agency outside time is coherent, but that's a side issue.
Right, that's a good question.
There are other kinds of explanation. And one that's getting a lot of traction in contemporary metaphysics is something that's called metaphysical explanation. You probably know about it. I'm not sure that makes sense either, but a lot of people think it does. And what some philosophers try to do is explain this kind of metaphysical explanation in terms of essences.
In terms of what?
Essences.
Essences.
Essences. Okay. You're probably familiar with this kind of explanation because the existence of God is sometimes done in terms of the invocation of essence. I mean, I'm not saying that you agree with it or anyone should agree with it, but you're probably familiar with it. So philosophers like Kit Fine think there's this notion of metaphysical explanation in terms of essences. So another possible kind of explanation is to explain the cosmos, its being, as it were, in terms of some kind of essence. Of course, then you have to attribute a certain kind of essence to the cosmos. That strikes me as rather strange, but if you believe this kind of language, I don't see it, it's impossible. So anyway, the main point is just that it does seem to me that there are other possible candidates for explanations. And then where the dialectic moves is, we have to look at all the kinds of explanations we can think of and kind of find which is the most plausible. So that's the second point. It's more of an observation than a question.
Yes. Yeah, very good. With respect to the first question, the principle of sufficient reason, as Leibniz originally enunciated it, was extremely strong, that every truth or fact has a sufficient reason for why it is so and not otherwise. And I think a good many philosophers are quite skeptical of that principle. It seems too strong to be plausible. And so I think if we're going to run an argument based on the principle of sufficient reason, we need to have a more modest version. Now, in the argument that I shared, it doesn't even appeal to the principle of sufficient reason in a modest form. Rather, it appeals to this very modest principle of causality, which is that anything that begins to exist has a cause. And the idea there is that something cannot come into being unless there is a cause that brings it into being. And it seems to me that that's a very, very modest principle that doesn't fall prey to the sorts of paradoxes that Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason falls prey to. Now, with respect to the second question, you're certainly correct that we have to consider all of the alternatives for what might be a timeless, spaceless, immaterial cause of the universe. And I considered abstract objects versus an unembodied mind. Now, my understanding is that an essence is an abstract object. In my metaphysical reading, essences are abstract collections of properties that something must have in every world in which it exists. And so that would fall under the same category as mathematical objects were. Namely, these are abstracta, and therefore they are causally effete, and therefore could not be the cause of bringing the universe into existence. So unless someone has a very different understanding of essence than the one I'm familiar with, it seems to me that this isn't a good alternative.
Okay, thank you. Is it okay if I make some further comments?
Yes, you can.
So let's take these things in reverse order. At least as I understand people like Kip Thien, an essence is a certain category of necessary property. So it's a property that things have in all possible worlds, but not any old property. It's got to be an object of a certain kind, but it's not an abstract object. It's just a necessary property of a certain kind, okay? On the first point about the principle of sufficient reason, I agree that an absolutely general principle of sufficient reason is kind of implausible. I worry about the weaker version too. You know, just for one reason, it doesn't seem to hold in quantum mechanics. I mean, how you interpret quantum mechanics is of course contentious, but at least on the Copenhagen interpretation, some things seem to come into existence without a sufficient reason.
Notice that the principle does not say that every event has a cause, but everything that comes into being has a cause. So it's quite consistent with quantum indeterminacy with respect to events like the decay of a radioactive isotope or something of that sort.
Yeah, but that brings something into existence, namely the byproducts of decay.
Well, there can be virtual particles, say, that might come into existence.
No, when a uranium atom decays, you get two smaller atoms. Those come into existence. Those don't lack prior causes. There are things from which those emerge. They don't come into being from nothing. Their existence is not caused.
Well,
it doesn't have a sufficient reason, because the reason is
let me say the second thing then let me say is that there are at least 10 different interpretations of the quantum mechanics.
Yes.
And some of these are fully deterministic, and therefore I see no reason to think that we should adopt, for example, a Copenhagen interpretation whereby indeterminacy is ontic rather than merely epistemic. And I think a good many philosophers of physics would agree with that. And so as long as there are deterministic physical interpretations that are empirically equivalent and use the same mathematical equations, I don't think that quantum mechanics is a proven counterexample.
Well, I didn't say it proved it. I mean, I'm not a physicist, as I said. I think the jury is still out on this one. So it's just a reason to be suspicious of the principle of sufficient reason in this weaker form.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we have a question. Wait, let me see, please. We have a question by Nicolas Molina. He wrote it down, so I will read it. The question says, in what sense this cause of the universe is not abstract? I am referring to God. I say it because an abstract object can't create anything. How we resolve the problem of assigning abstract qualities to God in a real universe? How do we connect this without falling in a wrong when we speak about real and abstract things?
Okay, I'm not entirely clear on what the question is, but let me make an attempt. God is a concrete object, not an abstract object. Abstract objects include things like numbers, sets, functions, propositions, possible worlds, properties, and so forth. But God would be a concrete object, but not a material object. Concrete objects can either be material, like physical things, or they can be immaterial objects, like souls or God himself. So God would be a concrete, not an abstract object. Now, does God possess abstract properties? That is going to depend upon your view of properties. I myself am an anti-Platonist. I don't believe that properties exist as abstract objects. I think they are just a useful façon de parler. They are make-believe entities that we pretend exist because they're so useful in talking about the way things are. So that if the dog is brown and small, we can talk about the brownness of the dog or the smallness of the dog. But I don't think that those things actually exist as abstract entities. I think this is just, these are just useful fictions. So I don't think that God has abstract properties either. I think that God is a concrete object that does not have any sort of metaphysical constituents.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so we have a couple more questions, and I think then we will end. So give me a second, please. We have an anonymous question that says, the Kalam cosmological argument does not evince that the efficient cause of the universe is a real being having the property of ontological security.
Well, that's just an assertion.
Yes.
If he thinks that, then he has to tell me which premise of the argument does he think is false and why. I've offered defenses, at least in some summary fashion, of the two premises. And if those premises are true, then it follows of logical necessity that there is a cause of the universe from which we can then deduce several significant properties like spacelessness, timelessness, changelessness, and so forth. So if he's going to say that the argument fails to establish the existence of such an entity, he needs to show which premise of the argument is not true.
Okay, thank you very much. We have one last question. Okay. The question says, I'm sorry. It was formulated by Jorge Acuña, and he says that no, Spinoza's Spinoza's God is not identified with the cosmos. For Spinoza, the cosmos is an infinite mode of God. There is a modal difference between God and the cosmos. The identity between God and the cosmos is pantheism, but Spinoza's God is panentheism because of the difference between God and the cosmos mentioned above. Have you considered the possibility of the existence of this God?
If I understand the question correctly, this question would identify God with the cosmos as a mode of the cosmos or something. And it seems to me that that argument might have some plausibility if the universe were past eternal. But given the fact that the universe began to exist, that it came into being, it seems to me very difficult to avoid the conclusion that the universe is not self-explanatory, but that there must be something transcendent beyond the universe which brought it into existence. And for that reason, I think this argument does eliminate all pantheistic religions of the world, like Advaita Vedanta Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, as well as polytheism. I think that it does winnow down the field of the world's great religions to the great monotheistic faiths, as I said earlier, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, or perhaps some form of deism. So I think the argument eliminates this idea that we should identify the cosmos with God.
Okay, okay, thank you very much. I think that were all the questions. So with this, we will give a closure to the Q&A. So thank you very much, Professor Lane Craig, for being with us today. Your answers were excellent. We deeply appreciate your time. And
well, let me just say before we go, thank you so much for the invitation and the honor of being at this conference. I only wish I could have been in Costa Rica personally. I hear it is a beautiful place and I hope to visit someday, but I'm glad at least that I could join you remotely for this conference. And I thank you all for your very interesting interaction.
Thank you very much, Professor Craig. So with this, we will give a closure to Dr. Craig's talk. And please, well, give me a second. So yes, with this, we give a closure to the talk. I will just read now what is going to be next, but it will be a conference in Spanish. So just a second, please. Wait. Oh, wait. Okay, so. Okay, this will be the last talk for today. It is going to be offered by Félix Alejandro Cristiá Batista. It will begin in about an hour. It is entitled Apropiación Cultural y Apropiación Epistémica sobre silenciar y hablar por otros. So with this, we will end today's session of the First International Congress on Logic, Epistemology, and Methodology of the University of Costa Rica. So thank you very much for your time and your questions. And I will just, before ending the session, say this in Spanish and we will end. Entonces, bueno, la última conferencia, muchas gracias a todos por acompañarnos y por sus preguntas. La última conferencia del día estará a cargo de Félix Alejandro Cristiá Batista. La conferencia iniciará dentro de 58 minutos. Se intitula Apropiación Cultural y Apropiación Epistémica sobre silenciar y hablar por otros. El link es este mismo, por el cual sesionamos durante este bloque. Y bueno, con eso terminaríamos por este momento. Vamos a dar un receso de 1 hora y volvemos a las 6 de la tarde. Muchas gracias a todos.